The dawn came thin as skim milk over the granite teeth of Black Slope, and the cold was a physical weight. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that found the flaws in your wool and the cracks in your soul. Down in the pass. The morning whistle of the Silver Meridian line cut the air, a sharp, metallic scream that shattered the quiet. The sound didn't belong here. It was too new, too hungry. On the high ridges, a congregation of crows sat like apostles of the frost on the fence posts, their feathers black against the heavy rime. Hollis Bracken felt the cold in his knuckles, a dull ache that matched the one in his chest. He rode his big sorrel, Clay, along the bank of Quailbone Creek, the water moving thick and sluggish, choked with plates of ice. He was checking the north line, a ritual that brought him no comfort. The silence out here was vast, broken only by the squeak of his saddle leather and the crunch of Clay's hooves in the crusted snow. He'd been alone on the Quailbone Ranch for 3 winters since his father passed, and each one felt longer than the last. The ranch house, sitting low and solid against the rise, had too many empty rooms. The porch, his father had always said, was built for sitting, but the bench near the door was just a place for the snow to gather. Hollis was a man carved from the same hard granite as the slopes around him, tall, broad in the shoulder, and quiet by nature. But the quiet of the ranch had started to feel less like peace and more like a void. He pulled his collar tighter, his gaze distant, his thoughts a silent monologue about the price of feed, the depth of the snow, and the persistent, gnawing emptiness of the porch. Miles away, in the burgeoning town of Garnet Hollow, the air smelled of coal smoke and yeast from the bakery. The town was nestled in a valley that acted like a wind tunnel, and the air was sharp with the sting of airborne ice. In a small shop off the main street, smelling of sharp metallic ink and lye soap, Tamsin Rowe turned the heavy iron crank of her flatbed printing press. With a heavy thump and slide, she pressed the ink onto a fresh sheet of heavy paper. She was a woman of precise, economical movements. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, revealing a face that was more striking than beautiful, defined by a strong jaw and eyes the color of a deep, shaded creek. She was printing a map, her map, the one her father had spent a decade surveying before the fever took him, the Chimneyback Pass. It showed the high roots, the hidden valleys, and, most importantly, the secret arteries of water that webbed the high country. She paused to wipe a smudge of black ink from her wrist, her gaze catching on the telegraph key in the corner. It was chattering. That wasn't unusual. The telegraph line ran parallel to the Silver Meridian tracks, and traffic was heavy. But this was different. The rhythm was wrong. It wasn't the usual news briefs or commercial orders. It was a tight, repeating code, one she'd learned to recognize from the railroad surveyor's Q47. Q47, a railroad acquisition code. It meant property secured, or asset claimed. It made the fine hairs on her neck stand on end. Before she could ponder it further, the world outside the window vanished in a flash of white, followed a heartbeat later by a hollow, deafening whump that rattled the bottles of ink on her shelves and shook the very floorboards. The press itself seemed to jump. She ran to the door and yanked it open. A column of greasy black smoke was already climbing into the pale morning, staining the sky. It was coming from the west end of town, the co-op. The big cooperative warehouse that held the winter stores for half the small ranchers and homesteaders in the valley. Shouts echoed, thin in the cold air. "Fire! The warehouse is afire!" Tamsin grabbed her heaviest coat, her mind racing. The co-op held everything flour, beans, seed grain, and lamp oil. If that went, Garnet Hollow wouldn't just starve, it would freeze in the dark. She joined the stream of people running toward the blaze. Men pulled the pitifully small hand pumper from the firehouse, their boots slipping on the already icing street. The fire was roaring, impossibly fast, feeding on the dry lumber and the tons of stored goods. The heat was a living thing, pushing the crowd back. "It's the oil," a man shouted, pointing to the blue-white heart of the inferno. The whole shipment of whale oil must have gone up. Then, a new voice cut through the panic, sharp and authoritative. This was no accident. Judge Enoch Pallardy stepped onto the boardwalk of the land office. his dark suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly combed. He held a strange, immediate authority, his presence calming the chaos just by existing. He always seemed to be present when things happened. "This," he declared, his voice rolling over the crowd, "was arson." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. The fire was too hot, too fast. This was malice. "And we have the culprit," Pallardy pointed. Not at the fire, but down the street. A stooped, trembling figure, Abel Thatcher, the town drunk, who spent most nights in the alley behind the saloon, was being held up by two grim-faced men. "Abel," the judge prompted, his voice like velvet over steel. "Tell them what you told me you saw not 5 minutes before the blast." Abel wiped his mouth, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and importance. I seen him sneaking out the back alley by the warehouse, carrying a can, ran right past me." "Who, Abel?" Pallardy asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. "Who did you see?" Abel's shaking finger rose and pointed, not at some drifter or railroad tough, but directly at Tamsin Rowe. "Her," he cried. "The print girl. Tamsin Rowe, I seen her clear as day." The crowd turned as one. 100 eyes, fearful and angry, settled on her. The air, which seconds before had been filled with communal panic, now focused into a single point of accusation. Tamsin felt the blood drain from her face. "What, no? I've been in my shop. I was—" "You were where?" Pallardy pressed, stepping down onto the street. "Alone, with no one to vouch for you. A woman who spends her time printing maps of land that don't belong to her." Before Tamsin could answer, a large figure pushed through the crowd. Mason Red Coulter, Judge Pallardy's unofficial marshal and the Silver Meridian's chief negotiator. He was a thick-bodied man with a face like cured leather and eyes the color of rust. He didn't speak. He just shoved a cluster of townsfolk aside and pointed 2 of his hired men, railroad bulls with clubs in their hands, toward Tamsin's shop. "Search the print shop," Pallardy ordered. A formality after the fact. "Look for the oil cans. Look for the matches." Tamsin's mind snapped into sharp, cold focus. This wasn't a mistake. It was a performance. Pallardy, the witness. Red Coulter, it was a trap, sprung and closed. And she knew what they were really after. It wasn't oil cans. She didn't run. Not yet. She backed away, step by step, as the crowd's murmuring grew uglier. "She's always kept to herself," someone whispered. "Those maps, my cousin said she was selling them to the railroad," another lied. Red Coulter was walking toward her now, his pace unhurried. He was enjoying it. Tamsin turned and fled. She didn't run toward her shop. They were already there. She ran the other way, toward the narrow alley between the mercantile and the assay office. She was light on her feet, but the ground was treacherous. "Stop her!" Coulter bellowed. She heard the heavy thud of his boots behind her, and something else, the clatter of hooves on the frozen street. They were bringing horses. She burst out of the alley onto the back road, a rutted track of frozen mud that led out of town toward the high country. Her lungs burned, the frigid air feeling like knives. She clutched the heavy wool of her coat. She had nothing. She hadn't grabbed her purse, her coat, or the map. She stopped, skidding. She had to go back. A shout from the alley. 2 men on horseback spurred their mounts onto the track, cutting off her retreat. She was trapped. She darted sideways, scrambling over a low stone wall into the livery yard. A large freight wagon, its canvas cover stiff with ice, was parked near the exit. She dodged behind it, gasping for breath, praying they hadn't seen her. A hand shot out from the wagon's shadow and clamped onto her arm like a steel trap. A second man, smelling of sour whiskey and unwashed wool, grabbed her other arm. "Got her! Red!" one of them yelled. "The judge said to be gentle, but she ain't making it easy." They weren't townfolk. They were hard men, strangers. They started to drag her, her boots scraping uselessly, toward a small buckboard wagon waiting by the fence. This wasn't an arrest. This was an abduction. "No!" she screamed, twisting violently, trying to plant her feet. "Let me go!" One of them laughed and backhanded her. The blow was clumsy but heavy, snapping her head back and sending a flash of white-hot pain through her cheek. She tasted blood. "Get her in the wagon?" It was at that exact moment that Hollis Bracken rode into town. He had seen the smoke from the ridgeline, a dark pillar against the morning, and had spurred Clay into a steady lope. Duty demanded it. A fire in winter was a threat to every man, woman, and child in the valley. He was riding past the livery, his eyes on the inferno down the street. When he heard the scream, it was short and sharp, cut off. He reined Clay in hard, the horse snorting a cloud of steam. He saw the struggle by the buckboard. Two men, railroad toughs by the look of their dusters, forcing a woman into the wagon. He didn't think. He reacted. He spurred Clay forward, covering the 20 yards in 3 bounds. The men looked up, startled, their hands still on Tamsin. "Let her go," Hollis said. His voice was low, flat, and carried the weight of the cold. The man who had hit her sneered. "Ride on, rancher. This ain't your business. This is Judge's orders." "I said," Hollis repeated, swinging his leg over the saddle and dropping to the ground. "Let her go." He didn't reach for the pistol on his hip. He kept his Winchester rifle, tucked under his arm, pointed at the ground. The first man let go of Tamsin and reached for his own sidearm. "You're a fool! Farm!" Hollis moved with a speed that belied his size. He didn't raise the rifle to shoot. He stepped forward and swung the heavy wooden stock in a tight, brutal arc. There was a solid, wet thud as the walnut butt connected with the man's chest, just under the ribs. The man's breath left him in a single, agonizing whoosh, and he folded, collapsing into the icy mud like a sack of grain. The second man, stunned, let go of Tamsin and raised his hands. "No trouble, mister, we was just—" "Get him," Hollis growled, nodding at the man on the ground. "And get out of Garnet Hollow." The man scrambled to obey, dragging his groaning partner toward the buckboard. He didn't look back. Hollis turned to the woman. She was leaning against the wagon wheel, breathing in great, shuddering gasps. Her lip was split, and a dark bruise was already forming on her cheek. It was the print girl, Tamsin Rowe. He'd seen her in the mercantile, but they'd never spoken. "I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She was shaking, but not from the cold. Hollis looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, something else. The same steady, unwavering clarity he'd seen in his father's eyes when he faced a blizzard or a wolf. He looked down at her hands, which were clenched into fists at her side. Her knuckles were raw, and her fingers were stained black with printer's ink. A woman who worked, a woman with steady eyes, in Hollis Bracken's world. That meant more than the word of a judge or the shout of a drunk. He'd seen liars and thieves, their eyes shifty, their hands clean. This woman was neither. He made his decision. It was absolute and irreversible. "Coulter's men are tearing my shop apart," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. They're looking for my maps." "Are they in there?" he asked. "No," she said, a flicker of defiance. "They're hidden, but the original plates—" She stopped. A shout came from the main street. "There she is, by the livery!" Hollis didn't hesitate. He stepped to his horse, grabbed the saddle horn, and looked at her. "They'll find you." "They'll take you to Pallardy. You won't get a trial, you'll get a rope." He offered his hand. "Come with me, now." She looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and stained from work, and then back at the sound of the mob. She took his hand. He didn't help her up. He hauled her, pulling her clean off her feet and settling her sideways on the saddle in front of him. He swung himself up behind her, his arm going around her waist to hold her steady. "Hold on to the horn," he commanded. He spurred Clay, not back toward the main street, but out, away from Garnet Hollow. They galloped past the last few houses, past the tannery, and out onto the wide, open expanse of the valley floor. It was a field of stubble and snow, dotted with the wooden stakes of the Silver Meridian's next planned expansion. Tamsin held on, her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat, the smell of leather and cold air filling her senses. She could hear the shouts fading behind them, lost to the drumming of Clay's hooves and the rush of the wind. They rode hard for 20 minutes, the horse's breath pluming in white clouds. Hollis didn't slow until they were well into the foothills, the town hidden by a fold in the land, at the end of a long, snow-dusted track. The low, dark roofs of the Quailbone Ranch appeared. It looked as lonely as he'd felt that morning, but now it looked like something else, a sanctuary. He didn't ride to the house. He rode straight to the big barn, dismounted, and lifted her down. Her legs were numb and she nearly fell. But he steadied her. He pushed the heavy barn door open just enough for them to slip inside, then closed it, plunging the interior into a dim, dusty twilight. The air was warmer in here, thick with the sweet, dry smell of hay and the scent of the animals in their stalls. He pointed up to the loft. "Get up that ladder. Bury yourself in the dry hay in the back corner. Don't make a sound. Don't light a lamp. Don't move until I come back for you. You understand?" She just nodded, her eyes huge in the dim light. She moved to the ladder and climbed, disappearing into the shadows above. Hollis watched her go. He stood for a long minute, listening to the silence of the barn. He had just brought the fire and the rope to his own door. He let out a long, slow breath, watching it cloud in the air. Then he turned, slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, and walked back out into the cold. Gray morning, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. The barn was a cold, vast darkness, but it was a safe darkness. Hours passed. Tamsin huddled in the hayloft, the coarse stems pricking her skin through her clothes, her body locked in a violent, uncontrollable shiver. The terror of the morning had subsided, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching cold and the throb of her split lip. She had been so focused on the map, on the telegraph, on the injustice, that she hadn't realized how thin her blouse was. She heard the heavy bar slide back, and she tensed, her hand flying to the small, sharp awl she kept in her coat pocket. "Miss Rowe." Hollis Bracken's voice was a low rumble from the barn floor. "It's just me. I'm leaving something on the ladder." She heard the clink of a metal cup, then the heavy tread of his boots moving away. A moment later, the barn door slid shut, and the bar dropped back into place. She waited a full 5 minutes before creeping to the ladder, by the faint light filtering through a high, dusty window. She saw a steaming tin mug of coffee, a thick, wool-lined canvas coat, by the size of it, and a folded piece of oilcloth containing a thick slice of bread and jerky. She pulled the coat on first. It was huge, smelling faintly of clean sweat, leather, and wood smoke. The warmth was immediate, a shock to her frozen skin. She wrapped her hands around the hot mug, the steam rising to sting her face, and drank. The coffee was black, bitter, and scalding hot. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. He came back just as the last of the light faded, maybe 4 o'clock. This time, he climbed the ladder, but he stopped 3 rungs from the top, keeping his head and shoulders below the level of the loft floor. It was a gesture of respect, of granting her the high ground. "They're searching," he said, his voice quiet. "Coulter and his men. They rode out to the adjoining ranches. They haven't come here yet. They will. You're in danger for this," she whispered, her voice rough. "I reckon." He didn't elaborate. "You said they were after your map. You got it." She nodded, tapping the long, cylindrical leather tube she had clutched to her chest since the moment she fled the shop. It had been strapped to her back beneath her coat, the one thing she'd grabbed instinctively. "It's here." "What's on it that's worth burning down a warehouse and hanging a woman?" Tamsin took a steadying breath. "Not what's on it, what it controls. My father was a surveyor. He didn't just map the land. He mapped the water. The railroad wants to run their line through Chimneyback Pass, but the route is dry. They need water for the steam engines, for the work crews, for the towns they plan to build." She shifted in the hay and slid the tube from her back. She unrolled the heavy, linen-backed paper. Even in the gloom, the precision of it was visible. The big ranchers, like Duke Barlow, They get their water from the main fork, she explained, her finger tracing a line. But the small homesteads, the drylanders, they all rely on the seasonal creeks. The railroad thinks those creeks are worthless, but my father found the source. Her finger stopped on a series of intricate blue lines, marked with symbols and depths. It's not just runoff. It's a series of high-altitude aquifers. Springs. They run underground, parallel to the pass. If you know where to drill, you can tap them. You can divert every drop of water that feeds the lower valley. The homesteaders will be dust inside of 6 months. The railroad gets its water. And Duke Barlow gets all that abandoned land for pennies on the dollar. This map, it's a deed to the entire valley. She paused. It's worth more than any gold strike. Hollis was silent. He climbed the rest of the way into the loft and crouched beside her, careful to keep a respectful distance. He looked at the map. His calloused finger, scarred from wire and tools, hovered over the symbols. He was a rancher. He understood the cold, brutal arithmetic of water. Her father hadn't just drawn a map. He had written a prophecy of wealth and ruin. The lines were so precise, the elevation marks so clear, it was almost chilling. They won't stop, he said. It wasn't a question. Pallardy, Barlow, Coulter, they're all in it. The Silver Meridian buys the judge. The judge gives Barlow the land, and Coulter is the hammer that makes it all stick. That fire, Tamsin said, her voice hardening. It was a diversion and a pretext. They needed to get me out of the way, discredit me, and seize my plates. They were in my shop when you found me. They were probably grabbing the plates then. And the witness Abel Thatcher. Abel wouldn't know me from Adam's off-ox, Tamsin said bitterly. But he'll say whatever Judge Pallardy tells him to, for a bottle of whiskey and a warm place to sleep. So it's your word against a judge and a drunk, Hollis summarized. We need more than your word. We need proof of their crime. Tamsin's mind, sharp and analytical, began to click, moving past the fear. The telegraph. When I was in the shop, just before the explosion, I heard a signal. Q47. It's a Silver Meridian acquisition code. Asset recovered, or target secured. They were sending it before the fire. Meaning they knew the plan was in motion. Hollis finished. Can you hear it again? The line runs right past your property, doesn't it? Isn't there an old signal station up on the ridge, the one they abandoned when they moved the main depot? Hollis nodded. The Juniper station. It's derelict, but the line is still hot. I need to get there, she said. If they're still using that code, if I can get a log. It's almost dark, he said, making a decision. We'll go now. It's a 2-mile hike, straight up the Shepherd's Trail. No one will see us. He led her out of the barn and up a narrow, winding game trail cut into the side of the canyon. The air was thin and bit at their lungs. From here, the valley was a quilt of dark shadows and pale snow. Garnet Hollow was just a small cluster of lights. One angry red glow still pulsating at its edge, the smoldering remains of the co-op. Hollis stopped, raising a hand. He pointed down, not at the town, but at the flatlands near the mouth of Chimneyback Pass. Even from this distance, they could see movement. A half-dozen men on horseback, and more on foot, working by lantern light. They weren't searching. They were working. Barlow. Hollis breathed, his voice tight with anger. That's Duke Barlow's crew. Tamsin squinted. What are they doing? It looks like they're moving fence lines. They are, Hollis said. They're pushing the boundary markers for the widow Jensen's property. And the Miller homestead, they're correcting the survey lines, pushing the small-timers off the creek access. They're not even waiting for you to be found guilty. They're just taking it. Tamsin felt a cold fury that eclipsed her fear. They use the fire. Everyone is in town, fighting the blaze or forming a posse. No one is home to protect their own land. Pallardy gives them the law. Barlow gives them the reason. And Coulter gives them the muscle. It's a perfect machine. Let's go, Hollis said, turning back to the trail. The Juniper station was little more than a shack, perched on a wind-blasted ridge. The door was gone, the windows shattered, but inside, coated in dust and birds' nests, was the telegraph key. Tamsin brushed the grime away. She found the wires, still connected, running through the wall. She put her ear to the post, listening to the faint electric hum of the main line. She pulled a small set of metal clips from her pocket tools of her trade she never left behind and expertly spliced her key into the main circuit. The relay began to chatter immediately. She sat on the floor, her legs crossed, the key in front of her, her eyes closed. She was listening, her head tilted, deciphering the staccato bursts of information flying across the territory. News, cattle prices, personal messages. Hollis stood guard at the empty doorway, a tall silhouette against the stars, his rifle held loosely at his side. After 10 minutes, her body went still. Click, clack, click, pause, clack, 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 pause, clack, 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 pause, clack, 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 clack. There it is, she whispered. Q-47, sent from the Garnet Hollow Depot, destination Silver Meridian head office, Denver. What's the message? Just the code, Q-47, and a confirmation chimneyback asset secure, local ordnance pending. Local ordnance. That's me. They're telling Denver they've got the maps and the laws handling the loose ends. She tapped the key, her fingers flying in a burst of code, then listened again. I just sent an echo query. It bounced back. The line is clear. They're not monitoring for taps. It's something, Hollis said. But it's not proof. It's just a code. We need physical evidence. Tamsin said, her mind working. We need to prove I didn't set that fire, which means we have to find out who did. Go back to the fire, Hollis said. The whole town is there. Not anymore. They'll have a few men watching it, but most will be at the saloon, drinking up the courage to form a lynch mob. The fire is out. It's just a smoking ruin. The evidence will be in the ashes, and it won't be there long. They moved back down the trail, using the shadows of the canyon walls as cover. They skirted the town. Coming up behind the burned-out warehouse from the alley, the place was a catastrophe. The main roof had collapsed, leaving a jagged black skeleton of charred beams. The air was thick with the foul, chemical smell of wet ash and burnt grain. A single, drowsy guard sat on a stool out front, but the back was dark and deserted. Stay here, Hollis said. No, Tamsin said, pulling the collar of his coat tighter. I know what to look for. I'm a printer. I work with chemicals. I know what they smell like. They're claiming I used an accelerant. Hollis gave a short, sharp nod. They moved together, shadows among shadows, into the wreckage. It was a field of black, sodden ruin, mounds of burnt flour, burst sacks of beans, all covered in a slurry of ash and water. They'll say I used kerosene or turpentine from my shop, Tamsin whispered, kneeling and sifting through the debris. Her hands, already stained with ink, were now coated in soot. She sniffed a pile of debris near the back wall, where the fire had clearly started. This is, she frowned, sniffing again. This isn't turpentine. It's not kerosene. It's fishy. Hollis knelt beside her. He picked up a fragment of a wooden crate, also soaked in the oily residue. He sniffed. Whale oil, heavy-grade lamp oil. Exactly, Tamsin said. The kind they use for the big signal lamps, the ones on the railroad switchers. I don't have this. I never have. It's too expensive. I use pig's lard oil for my lamps. But the railroad depot, Hollis said, has barrels of it. Tamsin's eyes met his in the dark. That's the what. Now we need the who. Hollis began to circle the point of origin, his eyes scanning the ground. The fire and the water from the pumpers had turned the alley into a mess of mud and slush. But here, under the slight protection of an overhanging eave that had collapsed, the ground was only half-thawed. Tamsin, he said, his voice low. She came to his side. He pointed. Pressed deep into the mud was a boot print. It was large, a man's boot, but that wasn't the important part. Tamsin looked at her own small, flat-soled boot. This print had a distinct, deep-set heel. Look at the heel, Hollis said. He pulled a match from his vest, struck it on his thumbnail, and cupped the small flame in the brief, flickering light. They saw it. The heel was ringed with small metal cleats, and in the center was a clear, star-shaped design. "Railroad boot," Hollis said, "the match dying. A ganger's boot, or a spike driver's, not a townsman's, and not yours." "Red Coulter," Tamsin breathed. "He wears boots like that. I've seen them. He thinks it makes him look important." "We have it," Hollis said. "A boot print they can't blame on you, and an accelerant you'd never have." Tamsin pulled a small notebook and a pencil stub from her coat pocket. She couldn't see, but she didn't need to. By feel. She tore out a page. "Hollis, light another match." He struck a second one, in the small pool of light. Tamsin's hand moved with rapid, precise strokes, sketching the layout of the warehouse, marking the position of the boot print relative to the back door and the pile of oil-soaked crates. "My turn," Hollis said as the match went out. He stepped to one of the standing fence posts that marked the alley's edge. He pulled his skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. He didn't make a big show of it. He just made 2 quick, deep cuts in the wood, a horizontal line and a short vertical line dropping from its center. It was his mark, the hanging T of the Quailbone Ranch. It marked the spot, a silent witness in the wood. "They'll cover this by morning," Tamsin whispered, folding the sketch and putting it deep in her pocket. "The print, maybe," Hollis said. "But they can't cover the smell, and they can't cover the truth." They began to trace the path away from the fire. There were other, more confused tracks, but the star-heeled boot print appeared twice more, heading not toward the main street, but down the alley, in the direction of the railroad depot. He set the fire and walked back to the depot. Tamsin reasoned. He probably met Pallardy on the way, pointed them to Abel Thatcher, and then went to send the telegraph message. "The whale oil," Hollis said, thinking. "It's not like flour. They log that. It's expensive. It's controlled. Every can that leaves that depot has to be signed for. Red Coulter is arrogant," Tamsin said. "He probably signed for it himself. He thinks he's above the law because Judge Pallardy is the law." "We need that book," Hollis said. "The depot's coal and oil ledger." They slipped away, back into the deep shadows of the canyon, and began the climb to the ranch. They were cold, covered in soot, and hunted. But for the first time since the explosion, Tamsin Rowe did not feel alone. "Tomorrow," Hollis said, as they reached the barn. "At dawn, the depot manager, Mr. Abernathy, he gets his coffee at the hotel at exactly 5:30. His office is empty for at least 15 minutes. We can get in, get the ledger, and get out." "We?" Tamsin asked, stopping at the ladder. "I can't read," Hollis said simply, without shame. "And I don't know Coulter's signature. I need you, and you need me to get you in." He gestured for her to climb to the loft. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we go back to town." He led her from the barn to the house under the cover of the new storm, a wall of white that had descended on the valley just after dusk. The wind was a living thing, a high-pitched shriek that scrubbed the world clean of sound and sight. Any tracks they left were erased in seconds. Coulter and his men would be holed up in the Garnet Hollow saloon, their hunt postponed by a power far older than a judge's warrant. The main room of the Quailbone Ranch house was built of thick, dark logs, squared off and chinked tight against the cold. It was a man's room, sparse and clean, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, metallic tang of rifle oil. A long, scarred trestle table dominated the center, but it was the hearth that drew the eye, a massive fireplace built of river stone, dark and cold. Tamsin stood dripping by the door, a small, soot-covered ghost inside his massive coat. She was shaking again, the adrenaline of their scouting mission draining away, leaving her exposed to the cold and the reality of her situation. Hollis didn't speak. He moved with a practiced economy, shedding his own coat and dropping it by the door. He went to the hearth, knelt, and began to build a fire. He worked methodically tinder, kindling, then larger logs of pine and oak. He didn't use a match. He struck a flint and steel, and a small spark bloomed in the dry grass, catching, growing, and finally roaring to life, throwing a sudden, dancing light across the room. He stood, his back to her, watching the flames for a moment. "The loft ain't safe in this," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the wind's howl. "The roof is tight, but the wind finds the cracks. You'd freeze by midnight." He turned, and his eyes found her, still by the door, her arms wrapped around herself. He saw her shiver, a deep, rattling tremor that had nothing to do with courage. He crossed the room to a low chest his father had built, carved from cedar. He opened it. The smell of dried lavender and old wool filled the air for a moment. He reached inside and pulled out a pair of small, fawn-colored wool gloves, knitted with a delicate cable pattern. They were clearly a woman's. He held them out to her. "My mother's," he said, his voice softening, just a fraction. Her hands were always cold. "They're clean. They'll be warmer than what you have." Tamsin looked at the gloves, then at his face. She slowly reached out and took them. The wool was impossibly soft. She pulled them on, over her ink-stained, soot-covered fingers. They fit. Hollis gestured with his chin toward a small, sturdy pine table in the corner, set under a window that was now a sheet of black, rattling ice. It served as his desk, covered with ranch ledgers and a few worn books. "You can sit there. The windows are too high for anyone to see in. Not in this storm. And the heat from the hearth gathers there." She moved to the stool, a small island of obedience in her sea of fear. She sat, turning slightly so her back was to the room, and stared at the dark window. Her hair, which had been tied back, was coming loose, a dark wave of it falling forward to hide the bruised and swollen side of her face. He let her be. He moved to the big cast-iron stove, stoked the fire in its belly, and filled a kettle with water from a bucket. The domestic sounds, the clank of the kettle, the sizzle of an errant snowflake finding the stovepipe were so normal they felt alien. He brought her a heavy ceramic mug of hot tea. He didn't have sugar, but he'd put a spoonful of honey in it. He set it on the table beside her, careful not to startle her. He didn't ask about the map. He didn't ask about Pallardy, or the fire, or what she would do next. He simply stood a few feet away, warming his own hands on the stove. "You're safe here," he said, his voice just loud enough to cut through the storm. "This house, it's stood for 30 years. It's held off blizzards worse than this one. The walls are thick. No one will find you here tonight. You can rest." Tamsin's gloved hand closed around the warm mug. She didn't drink. She just held it, absorbing the heat. Her gaze drifted from the dark window to the porch outside, barely visible. A set of simple tin wind chimes, cut into the shapes of a star and a crescent moon, was dangling from the eave, its ringing a wild, frantic countertenor to the wind's deep bass. Tink, 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 tink. A small, painful-looking smile touched her split lip. It was the first time he had seen her expression soften. "My mother hung those," Hollis said, his voice quiet. He'd seen her looking. She said a house was too quiet without some music. Said it was the valley singing back at the wind. Tamsin's shoulders, which had been clenched up around her ears, seemed to drop an inch. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was still a fugitive, still accused of a crime that could see her hanged. But in this room, with the fire and the tea and the sound of the chimes, she was, for a few minutes, just a cold woman getting warm. A sudden, violent gust hit the house like a fist. The entire structure groaned. The heavy front door, the one she was sitting near, rattled in its frame with a loud thud, thud, thud. Tamsin leapt from the stool, spilling tea on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She spun around, her back to the wall, her eyes wide with terror, expecting the door to burst open and reveal Red Coulter's face. Hollis had instinctively moved to secure the door, but her sudden panic stopped him in his tracks. He froze, a good 10 feet away from her, his hands held up and open, palms out. "It's just the wind," he said, his voice slow and calm. "It's a northeaster. It hits that door head on." Tamsin nodded, her breathing shallow. But she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the rattling door. Hollis stood rooted. He needed to bar the door. The simple latch wouldn't hold against this kind of pressure all night. But the bar, a thick beam of oak, rested in brackets right next to where she was standing. To get to it, he would have to walk directly toward her, his body blocking her only exit. He would have to loom over her. He was a big man. He was intensely aware of how he must look to her, a stranger who had pulled her onto his horse, hidden her in his barn, and now had her cornered in his house, miles from anyone. He didn't move. He waited until her breathing slowed. "Miss Rowe," he said, his voice pitched low and deliberate. "That latch won't hold. I need to drop the bar. The bracket, it's right there behind your shoulder." He still didn't move. He was asking. Tamsin stared at him. She processed the words. He wasn't telling her to move. He was asking for permission to approach. The men in the alley, the man who had struck her, they hadn't asked. Judge Pillardi hadn't asked. This man, who had saved her, who could have done anything he wanted, was asking permission to walk past her. The small courtesy was a bigger comfort than the fire. It was a shield. She swallowed and nodded, pressing herself flatter against the log wall to make room. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." He moved then. He didn't look at her as he passed, keeping his eyes on the door. He gave her as much space as the room allowed, his shoulder brushing the table. Not her. He lifted the heavy oak beam and settled it into the massive iron brackets. The thud was deep and final. The door went silent. The house felt instantly more secure. The small, polite question had settled something between them. Tamsin didn't return to her stool, but she unplastered herself from the wall. She watched him as he leaned against the door. Now a fortress. His arms crossed. The quiet, broken only by the storm, stretched out. "My father taught me," she said, her voice surprising them both. It was quiet, but clear. Hollis turned his head, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He just listened. "The engraving," she continued, looking at her gloved hands. "On the copper plates. He was a cartographer. For the army. Back east. He said a map was a voice. It tells the truth long after the man who drew it is gone. He said a line on a map is a promise. This is where the water is. This is where the pass is safe. This is where you can build a home." She looked up, her eyes finding his in the shadows. "He came west after the war. For my mother's lungs. He thought the high, dry air would heal her. It didn't. After she passed, it was just the two of us. We built the print shop from nothing. He taught me the lines, the chemistry, the pressure of the stylus. How to make the copper sing." She took a shaky breath. "He drowned. 3 years ago. The spring floods. The Quailbone Creek, down by the south confluence. It took his wagon and his team. He was coming back from a surveying trip." Hollis's jaw tightened. He knew that confluence. He knew what that creek could do in April. It was a churning, muddy rage. "All I have left," Tamsin whispered, "is the shop and this map. It's his voice. It's my voice. And Judge Pillardi, he wants to silence it. He wants to burn it, just like he burned the co-op." Hollis said nothing for a long, long time. He just watched her, his gaze steady. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say he was sorry. He just accepted the information as the truth it was. The only sounds were the fire hissing and the frantic, thin song of the wind chimes. And then another sound, a heavy, sliding shush, followed by a deep whoomph as a massive load of snow slid off the steep-pitched roof and crashed onto the porch deck. They both startled, their eyes flying to the ceiling, and then, at the same moment, to each other, the house had shrugged off the weight. A beat passed. The quiet that rushed in to fill the space was different. It wasn't an empty quiet. It was a shared one, a language of two people listening to the same storm, in the same shelter. Finally, the long case clock in the corner chimed 9. The night was deep. "You're done in," Hollis said, pushing away from the door. "You need sleep, real sleep." He gestured to a closed door off the main room. That was my parents' room. The bed is made. The stove warms that wall. It's the warmest room in the house." He pointed to a narrow, steep staircase in the corner. "I'll take the loft room, upstairs." He was giving her the master bedroom, the safest, most defensible room, on the ground floor. Tamsin was too tired to argue, but as she moved toward the door, her body tensed again. To sleep. In a stranger's house, to be that vulnerable. Hollis saw it. He understood it. He walked to the high mantel over the hearth, a place his father had kept his tobacco and his good knives. He took down a small, sharp dagger in a worn leather sheath. It was a skinning knife, but it was balanced, clean, and lethally sharp. He laid it on the small table by her bedroom door. Beside it, he placed a stub of pencil and a piece of paper torn from his ranch ledger. He didn't say, "Here, in case you're afraid of me." He didn't say, "Protect yourself." He just said, "The door has a good bolt, on your side, but the walls are thick. If you hear anything, Coulter, his men, anything, use the handle of that knife. Pound on the floor, 3 times. I'm a light sleeper. I'll hear it." He paused, his big, rough hand clumsy with the pencil. He scribbled 4 words on the paper, his letters blocky and strong. He pushed it toward her. It read, "If you need, wake me." He nodded at her. A single, brief dip of his chin. "Good night, Miss Rowe." He turned and climbed the narrow stairs, his tread heavy on the wood. Tamsin watched him go. She picked up the knife. The handle was smooth, worn to the shape of a hand. It was solid and real. She looked at his note. Then she turned the paper over. With her own precise, clear hand, she wrote her reply, "Tomorrow. I will prove it." She left the note on the table where he would see it in the morning. She went into the bedroom. It was simple, smelling of clean linen and the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The click was loud in the quiet room. A moment later, from the floor above, she heard the sound of his heavy boots dropping, one by one, to the floorboards. They were separated by 2 floors, a locked door, and a lifetime of trouble. But as Tamsin lay down on the mattress, still in his coat, still in his mother's gloves, the ice-cold knot of fear in her stomach began to thaw. The boundaries were clear. They had been drawn not by locks, but by a quiet, deliberate respect, and in that small, safe space, trust had begun to grow. The storm broke just before 4 in the morning, leaving the world in a state of sharp, frozen purity. The air was so cold it felt thin in the lungs, and the sky was a deep, star-pricked indigo. Hollis moved without light, harnessing his horse, Clay, to the flatbed wagon. He worked by feel, his motions sure and practiced. He loaded the wagon with 6 heavy bales of hay, arranging them to create a tight, concealed space near the front, shielded from view on all sides. He went back to the house. Tamsin was waiting, standing by the cold hearth, wearing his mother's gloves and his own heavy coat. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She'd washed the soot from her face and hands, and the bruise on her cheek was a dark, ugly purple in the dim light. "You can't sit on the seat," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You'll be seen." He handed her a worn oilcloth cap, the kind a boy might wear, and a dusty, empty mail satchel. "Put this on. Keep your head down. When we get to the depot, I'll cause a distraction. You know what you're looking for. The supplies and oil ledger," she confirmed. "S&O. Mr. Abernathy, the station master, goes to the hotel for coffee at 5:30. Every day, rain or shine. You'll have 15 minutes, maybe less. When you're clear, get back in the wagon. Don't come looking for me. I'll come to you." She nodded, pulling the cap on, tucking her dark hair up beneath it. The disguise was thin, but in the pre-dawn gloom, it might be enough. He led her to the wagon and helped her into the small, hay bale fortress. "Stay low. Don't speak. Don't move." Hollis climbed onto the driver's seat, his Winchester rifle resting in its scabbard. In easy reach, he clicked his tongue, and Clay pulled the wagon into motion, the wheels crunching on the fresh, crystalline snow. Garnet Hollow was a ghost of itself. The air hung thick with the smell of wet, charred wood. The fire at the co-op was a smoldering black skeleton, steam rising from its icy ruins. A few men, huddled around a barrel fire near the saloon, watched them pass. They wore armbands, a makeshift posse, their shotguns cradled in their arms. Hollis just nodded at them, his face a mask of a rancher tired of the cold. In town on business, he couldn't avoid. One or two nodded back, their suspicion momentarily lulled by the familiar sight of Hollis Bracken and his hay wagon. They reached the Silver Meridian Depot at precisely 5:28, as if summoned by Hollis's words. The short, fussy figure of Mr. Abernathy emerged from the station house, locking the door behind him and scurrying across the street toward the hotel, his small lunch pail in hand. Hollis drove the wagon right up to the freight platform. A young baggage handler, Silas, was sweeping the platform with a heavy push broom, his breath pluming. "Silas," Hollis called out, his voice carrying in the still air. Silas looked up, surprised. "Mr. Bracken, you're in early. Got a shipment of cattle for Denver, end of the week," Hollis said, swinging down from the wagon. He walked with a purpose, drawing the young man's attention away from the wagon and toward the freight office. "Need to book a car, a whole car." "A whole car." Silas leaned his broom against the wall. That's a lot of freight. Mr. Bracken, Mr. Abernathy handles the livestock manifests. He's at coffee." "This can't wait for coffee," Hollis pressed, his voice hard. "The last time I waited for Abernathy, my shipment sat in the yard for 2 days and cost me 20% of my sale. I need to see the booking sheet. Now." As the two men disappeared into the freight office, their voices already raised in a one-sided argument, Tamsin moved. She slid out of the far side of the wagon, landing silently in the snow. She slung the mail satchel over her shoulder, pulled the brim of the cap down low, and walked. She didn't run. She didn't sneak. She walked with a brisk, impatient stride, as if she were a telegraph runner, late with a message. She went straight to the station master's office. She tried the knob. Locked. Her heart hammered. Abernathy had locked it. She glanced at the freight office. Hollis and Silas were still inside. She looked at the window. It was closed, but the latch looked old. She pulled the heavy, sheathed dagger Hollis had given her from her belt, shielding her hand with her coat. She jammed the tip of the sheath between the sashes and pried. The old wood groaned. The latch popped, and the window slid open with a sandy scrape. She hoisted herself up and through, tumbling onto the dusty floor inside. The office was small and cold, smelling of stale pipe smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of the telegraph key. She was on her feet in an instant. The desk was a mess of manifests and waybills. In the corner, on a high shelf, sat 2 thick, leather-bound ledgers. One was marked Freight, the other So. She pulled it down. It was heavy. Her gloved fingers fumbled with the pages. She ran down the entries. Kerosene, 5 cans. Garnet Hotel. Lard oil, 1 barrel. Tamsin Row. Printer. She froze. That was her entry, from 3 weeks ago. Signed and paid. She kept turning, and there it was. Dated 2 days prior. Item whale oil, signal grade, QTY 22 cans, purpose line maint, and the signature. A confident, aggressive scrawl that barely bothered to form letters R. Coulter. He had taken the accelerant the day before the fire. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. She couldn't take the book. That was theft, and they'd know. She needed to copy it. She fumbled in her pocket for her notebook. It was gone. She must have lost it in the fall from the bridge. No, she desperately searched her pockets. All she found was a small linen handkerchief, one her mother had embroidered with a single blue T in the corner. It would have to do. She grabbed the pen from Abernathy's desk, uncorked the inkwell, and began to copy the entry onto the white linen. The nib scratched, spattering tiny dots of ink. She copied the date, the item, the quantity, and forged Coulter's signature as best she could. A heavy tread on the boardwalk outside, the jingle of spurs. Tamsin's breath hitched. She didn't have time to get to the window. The doorknob rattled as a key was jammed into the lock. She looked around, frantic. There was only one place. She dropped to the floor and slid, crab-like, into the dark, knee-knocking space beneath the heavy oak desk, pulling the mail satchel in with her. She curled into a tight ball, her face pressed against the dusty floorboards, praying. The door swung open. Tamsin saw the boots first. They were caked in mud, and the heels were ringed with metal. The star-shaped cleats were unmistakable. Red Coulter. He stalked into the small room, his presence making it feel tiny and airless. Tamsin held her breath, the taste of dust and lye in her mouth. She could smell the whiskey on him, even from the floor. "Abernathy," Coulter bellowed. Seeing the room was empty, he slammed his fist on the desk, right above Tamsin's head. The impact made her flinch, a shower of dust raining down on her. "That sniveling little where is he?" He paced, 2 steps to the window, 2 steps back. He was waiting for someone. He yanked open a drawer, rummaged through it, and slammed it shut. Fool's late. Outside, Hollis had finished with Silas. The baggage handler was flustered, promising to have the car available. As Hollis stepped back onto the platform, he saw Coulter's big bay horse tethered to the rail. His blood went cold. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that Tamsin was still inside that office. He heard Coulter's angry shout. He had to get him out. Hollis strode across the platform just as Coulter burst back out of the office, his face a thundercloud. "Coulter," Hollis said. His voice was flat, calm, and held a challenge. Coulter spun, his hand instinctively dropping to the pistol on his hip. He relaxed slightly when he saw it was Hollis. "Bracken, what in blazes do you want you here to join the posse for that arsonist girlfriend of yours?" "I'm here on business," Hollis said, planting his feet. "My business? But I saw your boss, Duke Barlow, out last night. He was moving the fence line on the widow Jensen's place." Coulter's eyes narrowed. "Just correcting a bad survey line. Rancher, all legal. Signed by Judge Pallardy himself. It's got nothing to do with you. Best you stay out of it." "That's homestead land," Hollis said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level. "The settlers on that creek have rights. The law says—" "The judge is the law in this valley," Coulter snarled. He stepped closer, jabbing a finger at Hollis's chest. "And you'd best remember who you're talking to. You and your little patch of dirt are next. Barlow wants that water, and what Barlow wants." He was so consumed by his own rage and arrogance, he wasn't paying attention. The morning sun had begun to touch the platform, melting the light dusting of snow into a paper-thin, invisible sheet of ice over the wooden planks. Coulter took a half-step back to emphasize his point, gesturing dismissively. His steel-cleated heel came down hard on the black ice. His foot shot out from under him. He didn't fall, but it was a close thing. He pinwheeled his arms, letting out a surprised grunt, and stumbled backwards, catching himself hard against a support post. The clumsy, violent movement hiked his muddy trouser leg up for a fraction of a second. High above the boot line, it was all Hollis needed to see. The star-patterned heel was clear as day. He wasn't the only one who saw it. Silas, the baggage handler, had come back out and was watching from 10 feet away. Hollis met the young man's wide, terrified eyes. Silas swallowed, then abruptly turned and retreated into the safety of the freight office. But he had seen it. A witness. "You'd best remember who you are." "Coulter," Hollis said, not missing a beat. "You're just a hired man, and you're on my side of the valley." Coulter, red-faced from the slip and the insult, regained his footing. "You just signed your own warrant." "Bracken!" Inside the office, Tamsin had heard the entire exchange. The second Coulter's voice was masked by Hollis's. She'd moved. She crawled from under the desk, ink-stained handkerchief clutched in her fist. She didn't dare risk the window again. She crept to the door, eased it open a crack, and, seeing Coulter's back turned to Hollis, she slipped out. She kept her head down, the mail satchel bouncing on her hip, and walked, fast, back to the wagon. She scrambled over the side and burrowed back into the hay, her heart feeling like it would burst from her chest. On the platform, Hollis gave Coulter one last, cold look. "Watch your step. Coulter, it's slippery out here." He turned his back on the fuming man, a deliberate, profound insult, and walked calmly to his wagon. He climbed onto the seat, not looking at the hay bales, and clicked his tongue to clay. The wagon rolled slowly out of the depot yard and turned onto the main street, heading out of town. They were a mile up the road, well into the canyon. Before Hollis stopped, Tamsin crawled out, her face streaked with dust, her eyes bright with a cold, furious triumph. She held up the handkerchief. The ink was smeared, but the words were clear. "I got it," she breathed. "He signed for it. 2 days ago. Hollis nodded, a grim smile touching his own lips. "Good. That's the nail. But they'll destroy that ledger the second they know we're onto them. Coulter will remember seeing me. He'll put it together." "I know," Tamsin said. "We have to make it permanent. Take the high trail to the Juniper station." 10 minutes later, Tamsin was back in the derelict telegraph shack. She hooked her clips to the line. Her fingers flew, the key chattering in the silent, cold air. She sent a long, detailed message to the U.S. Federal Marshal's office in Aspen Pit, 50 miles down the line. She identified herself. She detailed the arson, the false witness, and Judge Pallardy's clear conspiracy with the railroad. She sent the full text of the ledger entry, word for word, and named Red Coulter as the man who signed for the oil. She described the star-patterned boot print. She finished with a plea, "Send federal arbiter. Local law compromised. Hold copy of Garnetso ledger as evidence. Q47, T. Row." She sat back. Her work sent. The truth was out. It was on the wire, safe from Pallardy's reach. "It's done," she said. "Let's get you home," Hollis said. They took the shortcut back, the one that crossed the deep ravine of Quailbone Creek. The old wooden trestle bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for the wagon. They were halfway across, the horse's hooves thudding hollowly on the planks. When the first shot rang out, crack! The sound was shockingly loud, echoing off the canyon walls. A sliver of wood exploded from the wagon's side panel, inches from Hollis's head. "Coulter!" Hollis yelled, yanking back on the reins. He shoved Tamsin down, off the seat and onto the floorboards. "He must have followed us from town." Another shot. Ping! The bullet ricocheted off a metal-bound bale of hay behind Tamsin. On the far ridge, maybe 200 yards up, she saw the puff of smoke. Red Coulter and 2 other men, dismounted, their rifles resting on the rocks. They were pinned down. "We can't go back! We can't go forward!" Hollis yelled, pulling his own pistol from his holster. It was useless at this range. The bridge was a killing floor. A third shot slammed into one of the bridge's main support struts. Right beside them, the whole structure groaned. Hollis looked at the chain, at the ravine below, and at the horse, terrified in its traces. He made a desperate calculation. "Hold on," he yelled at Tamsin. "Cover your head." He didn't aim at the ridge. He aimed at the massive, rusted iron pin that held the deck's support cables to the planking, not 5 feet from them. He fired twice. The .44 caliber slug slammed into the pin. The old iron, stressed and brittle, shattered. The world dropped out from under them. It wasn't a clean fall. The bridge didn't collapse. It broke. Their section of the deck, torn from its mooring, swung violently down and sideways, held only by the cables on the far side. The wagon, the horse, and both of them were dumped over the edge. It was a chaos of screaming, splintering wood, and flying hay. They fell 20 feet, crashing into a deep, soft snowdrift on the creek bank below. Tamsin landed hard. The air knocked from her lungs. Hollis had twisted in the fall, landing half on top of her, his body shielding her from the bulk of the wagon's collapsing frame. The hay bales, bursting open around them, softened the final impact. For a second, there was a deafening silence, broken only by the panicked whinnying of the horse, tangled in its harness. Above them, on the ridge, Coulter was yelling, They fell. They're in the creek bed. Hollis was a dead weight on her, his breath coming in short, pained gasps. His face was inches from hers, his eyes squeezed shut. "Hollis," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Hollis, are you shot?" Her gloved hand, the one that wasn't pinned, came up and pressed flat against his chest, feeling for a wound beneath his heavy coat. She felt no blood, only the solid muscle of his chest and the frantic, heavy thump, thump, thump of his heart. He groaned, his eyes opening. They were dark, filled with adrenaline and pain. "My side." He managed to get out. He rolled off her, hissing as a jolt of pain shot through him. He pulled up his shirt. A long, dark bruise was already forming on his ribs, where he'd struck the wagon's axle, but the skin wasn't broken. They were alive. They were both alive. They stared at each other. The cold, the danger, the shared terror. They were tangled in a mess of hay and wrecked wood, their breath mingling in white clouds in the frigid air. The world had shrunk to the space between them. He was staring at her mouth, and she was lost in the intensity of his eyes. The moment stretched, became thick and quiet, a heartbeat suspended in time. "Find them!" Coulter's voice shattered the spell, sharp and clear from the broken bridge above. "They're alive. Get down there. By any means. Get that map tube. I want that map." Hollis grabbed her hand, his grip like iron. "The bridge under it, move." He pulled her up, and together they scrambled, half crawling through the deep snow and wreckage, disappearing into the dark, frozen shadows beneath the bridge's massive stone supports. Just as Coulter's men began their treacherous descent down the canyon wall, they didn't try to save the wagon. It was a splintered wreck, wedged in the rocks 20 feet below the broken bridge. Clay, his harness snapped, had scrambled up the far bank and vanished, a ghost of panic in the freezing dusk. The 3 hours it took them to walk back to the Quailbone Ranch house, cutting across the low ridges and icy creek beds, was a silent agony. Hollis moved stiffly, his right side a solid wall of pain where he'd hit the axle. Tamsin was running on pure nerve, her borrowed coat weighing a ton, soaked through with snow and mud. When he finally unbarred the front door and pushed her gently inside, her legs gave out. She didn't fall, but she sagged against the doorframe, a tremor starting in her knees and moving up her entire body. It wasn't from the cold. Not entirely. It was the crash, the sudden, violent realization of survival. The adrenaline fled, leaving her a hollow, shaking wreck. The house was cold and still. The fire from the morning had died to pale, gray ash. Hollis moved past her, his face a tight mask of pain, and went straight to the stove. He shoved in kindling, his motions jerky, and lit it. He found the oil lamp on the table and struck a match. A warm, yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing a room that was both a fortress and a prison. Outside, a strange sound had begun. The high-pitched shriek of the wind had died, replaced by a steady, heavy drumming on the roof. The blizzard had broken, and a rare, warmer front was pushing in, turning the snow to a cold, heavy rain. Hollis retrieved a thick wool blanket from the cedar chest by the wall. He unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders. She was soaked to the skin. "You're freezing," he said. His voice was rough. "You've got to get out of those wet things. Go in the bedroom. Bolt the door. I'll get the stove hot. I'll stay out here." She looked at him, at the way he held his right arm clamped to his side. He was hurt, badly, and he was still giving her the safest room, the most heat, the thought of being in that small, enclosed room, with the memory of the fall still so fresh, made her breath catch. The walls felt like they were shrinking. "I can't," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. It's too quiet, too small." She felt trapped, her mind replaying the splintering crack of the bridge, the weightless, terrible drop. "I need air." She turned, fumbling with the blanket, and pushed the front door open. She stepped out onto the wide, covered porch. The air was damp and surprisingly mild, smelling of wet earth and pine. The rain fell in a steady, silver curtain, overflowing the barrel at the corner of the eave. The porch deck was dark and slick. The little tin wind chimes, the ones his mother had hung, tinkled softly, a gentle, watery music. She huddled on the long, high-backed wooden bench near the door, pulling her knees to her chest, and stared out into the black, dripping world. Hollis followed, his heavy boots sounding on the planks. He brought the lamp and set it on the small table by the bench. Its light created a small, warm island, illuminating the falling raindrops, making them glitter. He stood over her, a massive, dripping silhouette. He could see the violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook her frame. He wouldn't leave her, but he wouldn't presume to sit. "Tamsin," he said, his voice low, pitched just above the sound of the rain. He'd used her given name, and it cut through her fog. She looked up, her eyes wide and dark in the lamplight. "I can stay," he said, his voice hesitant. "Here, on the steps. I'll keep watch. You're safe to sit. You're safe." It was the same courtesy as the night before. Another question. Not a command. He was giving her the choice. She looked at his face, strained and pale, then at the hand he kept pressed to his bruised ribs. He was in pain, but he was offering to sit in the rain, on the steps, to make her feel safe. The shaking in her body intensified, but its source was changing. From terror to something else. A profound, aching need. She nodded, a small, jerky motion. And then her hand, still covered in his mother's fawn-colored glove, emerged from the blanket and reached for him. She didn't touch his hand. She gripped his forearm, his wet wool shirt cold and coarse beneath her fingers. But the muscle underneath was as solid as the mountains. Hollis went utterly still. "I need to feel alive," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "On the bridge, I thought we were gone. I need to feel real. I need to know I'm not still falling." Her fingers tightened, her knuckles white. She was holding on to him as if he were the only thing stopping the porch from dropping away beneath her. He understood. He understood the void she had looked into. He understood the desperate, frantic need to be after coming so close to not being. He moved with a slow, deliberate care that was almost painful to watch. He placed his free hand, his large, calloused, working man's hand, over hers. He didn't squeeze. He didn't grab. He just covered her hand with his, engulfing it in a dry, steady warmth that seemed impossible in the damp night air. His eyes held hers in the lamplight. "Is this all right?" She didn't pull away. Her breath hitched. She nodded. Just once. He crouched in front of her, a difficult, painful movement, bringing his face level with hers. The light flickered across his features. He was still holding her hand. "You're soaked. You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "This wet coat is just making it worse. You'll be sick." He looked at the long bench. "Here, lie back, just for a minute. Get your feet off the floor." It was a practical suggestion, not a romantic one. Gently, his hand still covering hers. He used his other arm to support her back, guiding her. Tamsin let him. She was too exhausted to fight, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to. She lay back along the length of the bench, her head pillowed on the hard wooden armrest. The blanket tangled around her. His heavy canvas coat, the one he had lent her, was a sodden, muddy weight. "This is the problem," he said, his voice quiet. He knelt beside the bench, bringing him closer. The smell of him, rain and wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of lye soap, was all around her. His hand, the one that wasn't holding hers, moved to the front of the coat. It was held by 4 thick, wooden buttons. He looked at her, his eyes asking again, "May I?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. His fingers, scarred and blunt, were surprisingly deft. He undid the top button, his knuckles brushing the wet wool of her own shirt. But his touch was impersonal, focused only on the task. He undid the second. He was only unfastening the outer layer, the one that belonged to him. He reached the 3rd button, but it was jammed. The fall into the snowdrift had packed the buttonhole with ice and mud. It was stuck fast. "It's caught," he whispered, as if apologizing. He leaned in, his focus absolute. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to her own bone-deep chill. He carefully, painstakingly, worked his index finger between the button and the thick canvas, trying to get leverage. He shifted, his fingers sliding past the button's edge, brushing the cold, damp fabric of her collar beneath. Tamsin drew a sharp, sudden breath, her whole body tensed. Hollis froze. Instantly, his hand stopped, his eyes flying to hers in the lamplight. He was utterly still, ready to pull back, his expression one of profound concern. "Did I cross a line?" She stared at him, at the question in his eyes. He wasn't a man taking advantage. He was a man afraid of frightening her. He was safe. He was the safest thing she had ever known. She shook her head, a tiny, slow motion. "No, it's all right." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He freed the button, then the last one. He didn't pull the coat open. He simply moved his hand up to her collar, which was soaked through and plastered to her skin. He gently eased the wet fabric away, his thumb brushing the cold line of her jaw. He pulled the dry part of the wool blanket up, tucking it under her chin, cocooning her. "Better," he murmured. She could only nod. The simple, functional, respectful act drying her collar was more intimate, more powerful than any caress. He had touched her, but only to offer comfort. The shaking was beginning to subside, replaced by a different kind of tremor, a warmth spreading from where his hand rested on the blanket near her shoulder. She was alive. The rain was real. This man was real. She lifted her free hand, the one in the fawn-colored glove, and touched his face. Her fingers were trembling, but her purpose was clear. She laid her palm against the rough stubble of his cheek. Hollis stopped breathing. Tamsin's eyes were dark and resolute. She was no longer the victim. This was her choice. Her hand moved from his cheek to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his damp hair. She pulled him down. Hollis went, following her lead. He met her, his mouth finding hers in the dim, flickering light. It was not a kiss of fire, but of confirmation. It was a kiss of shared breath, of profound relief, of two people who had stepped back from the edge of a grave. It tasted of the cold rain and the night air. It was gentle, and then it deepened. Tamsin let out a small, broken sound, her fear finally shattering, and her hand on his neck tightened, pulling him closer. His other hand, the one that had been holding hers, came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her unbruised cheek. His lips were firm and sure, moving against hers with a tenderness that belied his rough, pained exterior. It was a slow, deep kiss that spoke of everything they couldn't say, the silent understanding in the barn, the shared danger on the trail, the simple trust of the barred door. His hand, still on her shoulder, squeezed gently, then relaxed, then squeezed again. A simple, rhythmic gesture that was profoundly grounding. She was here. He was here. A low, distant rumble broke the quiet. It was thunder, rolling down the valley from the high peaks, a strange sound for a snow-fed storm. The sound made Hollis pause. He drew back, slowly, his breath warm on her face. He didn't go far. He rested his forehead against hers. Their eyes closed. He was trembling now, too, with a different kind of energy, a powerful, banked restraint. He was a man who understood boundaries. He had reached one, and he would not cross it. Not like this, not in the dark, not when she was cold and afraid. "Tamsin," he whispered, his voice thick, "when this is over, when Pallardy and Barlow are done, when you're safe," he took a breath, "I want to call your name in the daylight, in the middle of town, where everyone can see, not in the shadows, not while we're hiding." It was a promise of a future, of a time when this wasn't an act of desperation, but a clear-day choice, a slow smile, the first real smile he had ever seen from her, touched her lips. It reached her eyes. The terror was gone. She was Tamsin Rowe again. "Then I'll hold you to that, Hollis Bracken," she murmured. She let go of his neck. With her own hands, she pulled the heavy duster closed again, her fingers, sure and steady now. found the button he had struggled with, and fastened it herself. She was reclaiming her own boundaries, her own self. Hollis understood. He sat up, moving from his kneeling position to sit on the edge of the bench, near her feet, giving her space but staying close. They sat in a comfortable, charged silence, listening to the rain. The storm was passing. From somewhere under the porch steps, a single, brave cricket, confused by the unseasonable warmth, began to chirp. The sound was so normal, so mundane, so defiantly alive, that they both looked at each other. A small laugh, quiet and rough, escaped Hollis. Tamsin's smile widened. They hadn't won, they weren't safe, but they were together. And for tonight, on a dark porch in the rain, that was enough. The light that woke them was a pale, watery gray. The rain had stopped, leaving the world dripping and raw. The porch was a mess of wet leaves, the wind chimes silent. Hollis had slept sitting up in the tall-backed chair by the cold hearth, his rifle across his lap, his body a monument to bruised stubbornness. Tamsin had taken the bedroom, but she hadn't slept. She had listened, to the house settling, to the rain fading, to the sound of his breathing, rough and strained, from the other room. She emerged as he was trying, and failing, to stand without groaning. His entire right side, from armpit to hip, was a map of dark, angry purple. "We have to move," she said, her voice quiet. "Before Coulter regroups. We have the handkerchief. We have the telegraph. We need the map," he finished. "It's the only thing that proves why." She nodded. The leather tube had been in a pouch on the wagon, and they had retrieved it from the wreckage. A small miracle in the chaos. She had clutched it all the way home. She laid the precious tube on the trestle table, the scarred leather dark and damp. She pulled the cork stopper and carefully slid the map out. She unrolled it. The heavy, linen-backed paper crackled. She spread it flat, and the blood drained from her face. "Hollis!" He limped to her side. "What is it?" "It's not my map." He looked. It was a map of Chimneyback Pass. The lines were correct. The paper felt the same. "It looks right to me." "No," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of ice. "It's wrong. It's all wrong. Look." Her finger, the one that still bore a faint ink stain, traced the main fork of the creek. "The aquifers, the springs my father found, they're gone. And this line, this contour—" She ran her hand over the surface, her eyes closed, feeling the print. "This is a fake," she breathed, her eyes flying open. "It's a forgery, a brilliant one. But it's not my father's plate. The lines, they're too shallow. The ink doesn't have the bite of a deep-cut copper plate." She grabbed his hand and pressed his finger to the cross-hatching on the mountain ridge. "Feel that it's smooth. My father's lines had depth. This was done with acid and milling. The engraver filed the plate down to get the shading." She was thinking aloud, her mind a razor, cutting through the deception. "Filing milling, it's a shortcut. Lazy work. I know who does this. I know this hand." "Who?" "An engraver. An itinerant. He came through Garnet Hollow maybe 6, 7 months back. Irving Sloat. He works out of a wagon, follows the mining camps, selling etched plates and forged claim certificates. I told him his work was shoddy. He knew I had my father's plates. He offered to buy them. I threw him out." "Where is he?" Hollis asked, his mind already on the trail. He was heading for the silver strike up at Red Juniper Wash. He said the miners paid well for fancy work. That's 10 miles, north, across the ridges. "Then we go," Hollis said. He grabbed his rifle. "If they made a fake map, they still need the real one. They'll be back. We have to get to Sloat first. He's not just a forger. He's their key witness." They didn't risk the road. The bridge was gone, and Coulter would have men watching the valley. Hollis, his ribs screaming a silent protest with every step, led them up the high, cold game trails. It was a brutal, 5-hour climb. The world was sharp rock and thin air. Red Juniper Wash was less a town than a wound in the earth, a gash of raw, red dirt, slag heaps, and a dozen miserable-looking tents, set apart from the others. Near a stand of skeletal junipers was a large, canvas-covered wagon with a tin chimney pipe. A thin, acrid tendril of smoke rose from it. Hollis didn't knock. He swept the canvas flap aside and stepped into the cramped, dark interior. The wagon smelled of hot metal, nitric acid, and stale sweat. A small man, with watery eyes and a cascade of ink stains down his shirt front, yelped and sprang back from a workbench. He held a sharp engraving tool, a burin, like a knife. "I didn't do nothing," Irving Sloat stammered, his eyes wide with terror as Hollis Bracken filled the only exit. "I paid my dues. We're not here for your dues." "Irving," Tamsin said, stepping in from behind Hollis. She unrolled the fake map and slammed it flat on his workbench, scattering his tools. "We're here for this. This is your work. You milled the plates." Sloat stared at the map as if it were a death warrant. The fight drained out of him, and he collapsed onto his stool, his hands shaking. He made me. I swear, I didn't have a choice." "Who?" Hollis asked, his voice a low rumble. "Barlow. Duke Barlow. And the judge, Pallardy. They came to me about a month ago. They had a copy of your map, Miss Rowe, a good one. They must have stole it from your shop and returned it. They said they needed adjustments, a new set of plates, a master copy. They called it for the new territorial survey." Tamsin's voice was arctic. "They told you to move the water. Move it, dry it up, erase it." Sloat whimpered, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "It's the new rail spur the Silver Meridian wants to run a line right through the Homesteaders Valley. But they can't get the federal right-of-way if the land is already legally settled and irrigated." He pointed a shaking, ink-blackened finger at the map. "So they had me make that. That's the map that proves the homesteaders are just squatters on useless, dry land. It nullifies their water rights. Pallardy, he's filing it with the federal arbiter this week. He's going to evict them all, maybe 30, 40 families. He was just waiting for the fire to clear the way. To get me out of the way." Tamsin finished. "So I couldn't show my father's real map." "They paid me," Sloat whispered. $100 in silver. They said if I breathed a word, Red Coulter would use my own acid on me. You can't tell him I talked." "We won't have to," Hollis said. He looked around the wagon, found a clean sheet of high-grade vellum and Sloat's pen. "You're going to write it down. Every word, every date. And you're going to sign it. It's my death warrant. It's your only warrant." Tamsin countered, her voice sharp as the burin on his bench. "You think you're safe now, we're here. Coulter will find out his map is useless the moment we show our faces. He'll come for you. He'll come for us. Your only chance is to pick the side that's telling the truth." Sloat looked at Hollis's grim face, then at Tamsin's cold fury. He took the pen. He wrote. Hollis stood over him, dictating. "Tell me again. What did Judge Pallardy say?" Sloat wrote, his hand shaking. The script messy but legible. He wrote about the meeting, the money, the threats, and the purpose of the fake map. It took 10 minutes. "Now sign it," Hollis commanded. Sloat looked at the pen, then at the ink pot. He was trembling too badly to write his name. "Your thumb," Tamsin said, her voice flat. She grabbed the pot of black printing ink. "Press it. A signature no man can forge." Sloat pressed his thumb into the ink and then onto the bottom of the vellum. A perfect black whirl of guilt and fear. They left him in his wagon, a ghost weeping over his ruined life. As they walked away, Tamsin pulled the small, precious collection of evidence from her pockets. The ink-stained handkerchief with the ledger entry, her own sketch of the star-heeled boot print, and now, Sloat's signed confession. "It's a chain," she said, her voice vibrating with a new, hard strength. 1. Coulter sends the Q-47 acquisition signal before the fire. 2. He signs the depot ledger for the whale oil before the fire. 3. His boot print is at the origin of the fire. 4. Sloat confesses that Barlow and Pallardy hired him to create a fraudulent map, giving them the motive for the fire, the motive for the frame-up. It's all here. It's a perfect case. It's worthless in Garnet Hollow, Hollis said, stopping to scan the ridgeline. Pallardy will burn that confession and us with it. We can't go to the Marshall and Aspen pit. That's 50 miles south, and Coulter will be watching every road. We don't go south, Tamsin said, her mind already 3 steps ahead. We go to Mint Hollow. It's closer, 10 miles, over the ridge. The federal circuit judge, Elias Thorne. He's a traveling arbiter. He's due there today to settle the mining claims. He's not on Pallardy's payroll. He's a federal man. He's our only chance. 10 hard miles, Hollis said, looking at the sun. It was just past noon. Let's go. The path to Mint Hollow was a narrow goat trail etched into the side of the mountain. A sheer drop on one side. They were exposed, visible for miles. They had been walking for an hour, the silence broken only by the wind and the scrape of their boots on shale. When the sound came, a sharp, flat crack that was not the echo of a rock slide. A split second later, a whine snapped past Tamsin's head. So close she felt the displaced air. A chip of granite exploded from the rock face just in front of her. "Sniper!" Hollis yelled. He didn't think. He reacted. He grabbed her around the waist and threw his body, and hers, off the trail. They didn't fall far. They tumbled down a short, sharp incline of loose rock and slammed into a narrow crevice, a natural crack in the granite barely 5 feet deep. Hollis hit first, his injured ribs taking the full impact against the unyielding stone. He let out a choked, agonizing gasp. Tamsin landed on top of him. The small, folded packet of evidence, the handkerchief, the confession. The sketch was jolted from her coat pocket. It slid on the wet rock, spun, and came to rest on the very lip of the crevice, balanced precariously over a sheer 200-foot drop. Another shot. Pang! The bullet struck the rock right where they had been, spraying them with granite dust. "Don't move," Hollis grated, his voice strained with pain. He was pinned, and Tamsin was shielded by his body. He's up high, on the overhang. It's Coulter. "The papers," Tamsin breathed, her eyes fixed on the small white packet, fluttering in the wind. Red Coulter's voice boomed down, amplified by the rocks. "Give it up. Bracken, I saw you at Sloat's wagon. I know what you got. Throw out the girl and the confession, and I'll let you bleed out in peace." Tamsin's mind raced. The sun was high, directly overhead, blindingly bright on the wet rocks. She fumbled in her other pocket. Her fingers closed on a small, silver-backed mirror, a simple vanity item. The only other thing she'd managed to save. "Where is he?" she whispered, her mouth close to Hollis's ear. Hollis, pinned beneath her, risked a glance. High left. See the black rock, the one that looks like a thumb? He's there. I can see the sun on his rifle barrel." Tamsin's hand emerged from the crevice. She angled the small mirror, catching the high noon sun, a beam of pure, white light, no bigger than a man's hand. Shot out. She swept it across the ridge. Searching. "Ah, damn you," Coulter roared. As the light flashed across his eyes, Tamsin held it steady, focusing the beam right on the glint of the rifle barrel. She was blinding him. "Now?" Hollis whispered. "When I move, grab the papers." It was not a question. He heaved his body, rolling them both, ignoring the fire in his side. He pushed Tamsin flat against the rock and brought his Winchester to his shoulder in one fluid, agonizing motion. He was clear of the crevice for less than 2 seconds. He didn't aim for Coulter. He aimed for the rifle. He fired. The crack of his rifle was followed by a high-pitched, metallic clang and a scream of pure rage. "He's hit," Tamsin said. "No," Hollis panted, chambering another round. "The rifle?" High above, Red Coulter's rifle clattered down the rock face. Its barrel split and bent at an impossible angle. The wooden stock shattered. He was disarmed. "He's coming down," Hollis yelled, pulling Tamsin up. "He's unarmed, but he's not finished." They scrambled up out of the crevice just as Red Coulter, his face a mask of fury, came sliding down the shale, his hand grabbing for the pistol on his hip. Hollis stepped forward. He didn't raise his rifle to shoot. Just as Coulter's pistol cleared the holster, Hollis swung the heavy rifle in a flat arc. The steel barrel connected with Coulter's wrist. The snap of bone was sickeningly loud in the thin air. The pistol flew from his numb fingers. Coulter, roaring in pain, lunged at Hollis with his good hand. Hollis, instead of pulling back, stepped into the attack, bringing the thick walnut butt of the rifle up hard, catching Coulter directly under the chin. Coulter's head snapped back, his eyes rolled, and he collapsed in a heap on the narrow trail. Tamsin scrambled past him and snatched the packet of evidence from the ledge, clutching it to her chest. "Your belt," she said, breathing hard. Hollis, panting, nodded. They didn't tie him like an animal. They used Hollis's thick leather belt to bind his wrists securely. They were standing over his unconscious body, catching their breath, when they heard voices from down the trail. "Hello, hello, the trail we heard shooting." 3 men, miners by their look, rounded the bend, leading a pair of heavily laden mules. They stopped dead, their eyes going from Hollis, bruised and bleeding, to Tamsin, her coat torn, to the infamous Red Coulter, tied on the ground. That's Red Coulter," the lead miner said, his hand moving to his own sidearm. "He's Judge Pallardy's man," Hollis said, his voice carrying the clear, cold authority of the truth. "He ambushed us. He's wanted for arson and conspiracy to commit fraud in Garnet Hollow." The miners looked skeptical. "Those are heavy words. Mister, Coulter is the law, most days." "Then look at his feet," Tamsin said. Her voice was sharp and clear, cutting through their doubt. She knelt in the damp mud of the trail and pointed to the deep, perfect impression left by Coulter's boot heel. "Look at the star-shaped cleat. We have 3 witnesses in Garnet Hollow who will testify they saw this exact track in the mud by the co-op fire." The miners looked at the boot. They looked at the print. They looked at each other. They'd all heard about the fire, and they'd all heard rumors about Pallardy and Barlow. "We're taking this man, and this evidence," Tamsin said, holding up the packet, "to Mint Hollow, to Judge Elias Thorne." The lead miner looked at Coulter, then at Hollis, then at Tamsin. He spat a long stream of tobacco juice over the cliff edge. "Reckon we can see you get there," he said, nodding slowly. "Reckon Judge Thorne would be mighty interested in a story about a star-heeled boot." The miners took Red Coulter. They lashed him, bound and cursing, to one of their mules, his broken wrist a clear, visible symbol of his defeat. They were hard, quiet men, and they had seen enough. The star-heeled boot print was evidence even they could understand. They would take him, and their own testimony as witnesses to the capture, to Judge Thorne in Mint Hollow. "We'll see the federal man hears it. Mr. Bracken," the lead miner had said, his eyes respectful. "You and the lady best secure your end." Hollis and Tamsin didn't follow. They cut back across the ridge, taking the low, fast game trails back to the Quailbone Ranch. They arrived in the dying, purple light of dusk, exhausted, bruised, and victorious, but the victory felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, black river. They entered the quiet kitchen, and the reality of what they had done settled around them. The lamp was still on the table from the night before, a pool of warm, yellow light in the growing dark. Tamsin sat at the trestle table. She pulled the 2 most important pieces of evidence from her pocket Sloat's signed confession and the small, ink-stained linen handkerchief. The confession was solid, vellum and ink, a legal document. But the handkerchief, it was smeared. The ink blurred by the rain and the fall. It was the truth, but it was fragile. It was the beginning of their fight, and it looked as if it could be washed away. "It's a mess," she whispered, her voice rough with fatigue. Hollis watched her, his bruised side making him stand stiff and awkward. "It's enough. It's the truth. Truth has to hold," she said. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes landing on the small cedar chest by the hearth, the one that had held his mother's gloves. She went to it and opened it. Inside, beneath the folded blankets, was a small, rosewood sewing box. She brought it to the table. From it, she took a needle and a spool of dark blue silk thread, the exact color as the small, faded T her mother had embroidered in the corner so many years ago. She threaded the needle. Her hands, scraped and raw from the rocks, were surprisingly steady. Hollis watched, confused. "What are you doing?" "They burned the warehouse," she said, her voice quiet and intense, her eyes focused on the work. "They tore my shop apart. They tried to burn the truth. They will not burn this." She didn't try to mend the cloth. She began to stitch, her movements small, precise, and certain. She followed the outline of her mother's original embroidery, sewing over it, reinforcing the T. Then she moved the needle, creating a new, tight, box-like border of blue silk around the smeared ink stains. She was walling it in, protecting the evidence with her own identity, her own past. Each pass of the needle was a vow. Each knot was a promise. She was, as her father had taught her, using a sharp tool to make a permanent mark. As she pulled the final stitch tight, a new sound began. A low moan from outside. The wind, which had been still all day, was returning. But this was a different wind. It was a heavy, shearing gale, the kind that came down from the high peaks with the force of a locomotive. The house groaned. The tin wind chimes on the porch clanged. Not a song, but a warning. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the ridge above the house, louder than Coulter's rifle. It was the sound of a great tree, or a great pole, snapping in two. Tamsin's head shot up, her eyes wide with a new, sudden dread. "Hollis, the line!" They didn't wait. They grabbed their coats and ran, Hollis limping badly, up the game trail to the derelict Juniper station. It was worse than they feared. The main telegraph pole, the one she had used to tap the line, was a casualty of the wind. It had snapped at its base, the heavy trunk falling down the canyon, leaving the copper wire lying dead and useless in the wet mud. They were cut off. "No," Tamsin breathed, the wind tearing the word from her lips. "I sent the first message, but I didn't send Sloat's confession. I didn't send word that we have Coulter. Judge Thorne, he only has half the story. Pallardy can deny it all." Hollis stared at the broken pole, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The wind howled, a physical blow, threatening to push them from the ridge. "No, he won't," he growled. He looked around, his rancher's eyes sizing up the disaster. "The line's not broken, it's just grounded. We just have to get it off the earth." He pointed to a stack of cured cedar fence posts, left over from a long-dead project, half buried near the shack. "We'll build a new mast, a temporary one, just high enough." It was brutal work. Hollis took the heavy iron post-hole digger, a tool that required 2 good arms and a strong back. He had neither. He raised the tool, his face a mask of white-hot agony as his ribs screamed, and slammed it into the rocky soil. Tamsin cleared the mud and rock with her hands. Each blow was a gasp of pain from Hollis, but he didn't stop. Thud, gasp, thud, gasp. In 20 minutes, they had a hole. 3 feet deep, they lifted the longest, thickest cedar post, a 10-foot mast, and set it. Tamsin tamped the earth and rocks back into the hole with her boots, packing it tight, while Hollis leaned his full, heavy weight against the pole, keeping it upright against the gale. "It's set," she yelled over the wind. "Now the wire. I can't lift my arms," he gritted out, his body clamped to the pole. "And I can't hold this and climb." He looked at her. "You have to." The wire was 30 feet away, heavy and slick with ice. Together, they dragged it back. Tamsin looked at the pole. It was a sheer, slick-barked piece of wood, vibrating in the wind. "I can't. I'll slip." "Yes, you can," he said. He braced his back against the pole, his feet planted wide. "My boot, my shoulder, go!" He offered his body as a ladder. Tamsin didn't hesitate. She stepped into his cupped hand, onto his knee, onto his broad, solid shoulder. He straightened, his whole body shaking with the strain, lifting her the first 6 feet. From there, she scrambled, half climbing, half crawling, up the pole. She clung to it like a cat, the wind trying to peel her away. She reached the top. She pulled the wire, scraping the ice from it with her gloved hands, looping it over the top of the post. It was too high. She couldn't secure it. "The insulators," she shouted down. Hollis saw them, the small ceramic knobs, nailed to the broken part of the old pole. He ripped 2 of them free. He couldn't throw them. He looked up at her, clinging for dear life. "Hold on." He left the pole. Tamsin screamed as it swayed violently in the wind, but he had packed it tight. It held. He scrambled up the rocks, found a high ledge, and threw the ceramic knobs, one by one, until she caught one. She hammered it into the post with a rock from her pocket, threaded the wire, and yelled, "It's done!" She slid down, collapsing at the base. Hollis was already in the shack, his hand on the telegraph key. It was chattering. It was alive. "You send it," he said, moving aside. "You know the words." Tamsin sat, her fingers finding the key, and began to send. She sent Sloat's confession, word for word. She sent the names of the miners who were witnesses. She sent the news of Coulter's capture. She sent it all, twice, to Mint Hollow, and again to Aspen Pit. Then they went home. The kitchen was a sanctuary, golden and warm. The storm, a muffled roar outside. Tamsin sat at the table, a clean sheet of paper in front of her. She was writing, pulling all the threads together, the Q-47, the oil ledger, the boot print, the forged map, the confession. A final, clean report for Judge Thorne. When she was done, she slid the paper across the table to Hollis, who was nursing his ribs by the stove. "I'll read it," she said. "You listen. Tell me where it sounds weak. Tell me where a lawyer could twist it." Hollis nodded, his face grim. She began to read, her voice clear and steady. "To the attention of Federal Arbiter Elias Thorne, we, the undersigned, do hereby present evidence of a conspiracy." "Conspiracy is a weak word," Hollis interrupted, his voice a low rasp. "It's a city word. Pallardy will laugh at it." Tamsin stopped. "You're right." She dipped the pen, scratched out the word. "What, then?" "A gang," Hollis said. "A land-stealing gang. That's what they'll understand." She wrote it down. She read the next line. "With the intent to defraud the homesteaders of their legal claims. Defraud is another one." He said, "No, with the intent to steal their water and starve them out. Use plain words. Tamsin, this is a fight for land, not a debate." She nodded, her pen flying. She read the next part, about the fire. "Set as a pretext for the false arrest of Tamsin Rowe." "No," Hollis said, his voice hardening. He stood up, ignoring the pain, and limped to the table. He put his finger on the line. "Cross it out. Write this. Set to burn the valley's food, and to hang an innocent woman, all to cover the theft of the Chimneyback Springs." Tamsin looked up at him. His eyes were blazing. She wrote his exact words. They worked for an hour. The two of them, chisel and hammer, forging the document. They cut away every polite word, every legal ambiguity, and left only a hard, sharp weapon of pure truth. When they were finished, the telegraph key was silent. The report was sent. The work, for now, was done. The silence that filled the kitchen was deep and heavy, filled with the exhaustion of the last 2 days, and the dread of the one to come. Tamsin sat staring at her own ink-stained fingers, which were trembling. Now that the adrenaline was gone, Hollis moved to the stove, poured 2 mugs of coffee, and set one on the table beside her. His hand, calloused and warm, found hers. He didn't grab it. He just covered it, his touch a silent anchor. She looked up at him, her eyes dark with exhaustion. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet, all the roughness gone. "In Mint Hollow, or in the middle of the street in Garnet Hollow, wherever that judge sits, when they call your name, when they try to make you stand alone." He squeezed her hand. "I'll be standing there, right next to you. Not half a step behind, not 1 inch away. I promise." Tamsin's throat felt tight. She gripped his hand, her strength returning. "They'll call you a liar, an accomplice. Let 'em," he said. "It's my word against Pallardy's, and my word is good on this creek." A fire, slow and steady, was kindled in her. She pulled her hand from his and went to the hearth. She didn't get the sewing box. She picked up a sharp, black shard of charcoal. She walked to the heavy log wall by the front door, the same wall she had pressed against in terror just 2 nights before. And in her clear, strong engraver's script, she wrote, the charcoal scraping loudly in the quiet room. Water belongs to the grass growers, not to the stamp. It was a statement of fact. It was a declaration of war. Hollis watched her. He nodded once, a slow gesture of profound respect. He drew his own knife from the sheath on his belt. He took her hand and led her out onto the damp, cold porch. The wind had died, leaving the air sharp and clean. He walked to the main gate post, the one that marked the entrance to the Quailbone Ranch, with sure deep cuts. He carved a symbol into the wet wood, a perfect, simple horseshoe, open and up, to catch the luck. "For the ranch," he said. Then he turned and offered the knife to her. "Handle first." She took it. Her hand was steady, beside his horseshoe. She carved her own mark, not her initial. She carved a dandelion. The stubborn, star-shaped weed that grows in cracks, that survives fire, that breaks rock, and that always comes back. A horseshoe and a dandelion, their own private treaty, carved in wood. They were standing there, watching the first pale gray light of dawn touch the mountains, when they heard it. A horse, ridden fast and desperate, coming up the road from town. Hollis shoved Tamsin behind him, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip. A lone rider burst from the trees. His horse lathered. It wasn't Coulter. It wasn't Barlow. It was Silas, the young depot clerk. He half fell, half jumped from the saddle, his face pale with terror. "Mr. Bracken, Miss Rowe, you gotta run. You gotta hide. Now." "What is it?" "Silas," Hollis demanded. "We sent the report. The federal judge has it." "That's just it," Silas panted, holding his side. "You sent it, but Pallardy, he must have a man on the wire down in Aspen Pit. He got a copy. He knows everything." "He knows you tapped the line. He knows you saw the ledger." Silas fumbled in his coat, pulling out a crumpled, damp poster. "He just nailed this to the courthouse door, not 10 minutes ago." Hollis took it. He didn't need to read it. He knew. Tamsin read it over his shoulder, her blood turning to ice. It was a new warrant. It didn't mention arson. It didn't mention the co-op. Wanted Tamsin Rowe for crimes against the Silver Meridian Railroad, sabotage of the territorial telegraph line, theft of proprietary railroad documents. "It's a trap," Tamsin whispered, her voice hollow. "It's not about the fire. He's switching the crime. He'll arrest me as a railroad saboteur. He's using railroad law. The federal judge, he'll have no jurisdiction. Judge Thorne will never even see me." In the distance, from the road to town, they heard a new sound. Not one horse, a dozen. The jingle of harness and the low, angry murmur of a posse. "He's fast," Hollis growled. He grabbed her arm. "They're already on the road. They want me." Tamsin said, "They'll get me," Hollis replied, his eyes scanning the ranch. "The house is a trap. The barn is the first place they'll look." He ran to the porch, to a dark, recessed corner, and kicked aside a woven mat. Beneath it was a heavy iron ring. He heaved, and a trap door opened, revealing a black, dusty square. "The coal cellar. It's dry. Get in. Stay silent. Do not come out. No matter what you hear, promise me. Tamsin." "Hollis, no," she said, grabbing his shirt. "I'll face them with you. We'll stand together. You'll stand with Thorne," he corrected, his voice a hard command. "You can't do that if Pallardy has you in irons. I can't protect you in his jail. Get in. Now I'll lead them off." He didn't wait for an answer. He kissed her. A hard, fast, desperate press of his lips, tasting of coffee and fear. And then he lowered her into the darkness. He shut the door, threw the mat over it, and ran to the barn. Tamsin huddled in the cold. Black space, the smell of coal dust filling her lungs. She heard him saddle Clay. She heard the barn doors burst open. She heard him ride out, not away, but straight toward the posse, yelling, drawing them away from the house. She heard the shouts. "There he is! Bracken, stop!" She listened to the thunder of the horses galloping past, chasing him up the North Canyon. She counted to 100. her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of his promise. "I'll stand right next to you." She pushed the heavy trap door open. The morning air was cold and bright. She saw the posse disappear over the ridge, in full pursuit of a man who was deliberately leading them on. She would not let him be alone. Tamsin Rowe slipped from the cellar. She didn't go to the house. She ran, low and fast, to the deep, muddy ravine of Quailbone Creek. It was the low road, the one that ran unseen, parallel to the main track. It was the one that led straight to Garnet Hollow. Garnet Hollow's town square was a powder keg, and Judge Enoch Pallardy was holding the match. The cold was a bitter, biting thing, but the square was packed, shoulder to shoulder. The entire valley had turned out. Homesteaders in patched canvas stood next to merchants in wool. Miners, drawn by the news, stood with their arms crossed, and woven among them. A dozen hard-faced men wearing the Silver Meridian badge, Barlow's men, acting as a human fence to keep the crowd back from the courthouse steps. They were the visible muscle of the conspiracy. The air still smelled of the co-op fire, a sour, wet-ash reminder of the town's vulnerability. Judge Pallardy stood on the top step, his black suit immaculate, his silver hair stirred by the wind. He was not a man conducting an arrest. He was a man delivering a sermon. "This warrant," he boomed, his voice rolling over the silent crowd, "is not about a simple fire. This is about the future of this territory. This is about security. Tamsin Rowe, aided by the rancher Hollis Bracken, did willfully and with malice sabotage the territorial telegraph line." He let the words hang. Sabotage, a federal crime. She has stolen railroad documents, proprietary surveys, in an attempt to halt the progress of the Silver Meridian line. She is an enemy of prosperity. She is an enemy of the law. A warrant is issued for her, and for her accomplice, Hollis Bracken. They are outlaws, and they will be brought to justice. He was enjoying it. He was cementing his power, twisting the narrative so completely that even if she were found, her original claims of arson would be lost, buried under this new, more serious, and entirely fabricated charge of treason. This hearing is open." The voice was not Pallardy's. It came from the back of the crowd, deep, quiet, and absolutely certain. The crowd stirred, murmuring, turning, and then parting, creating a wide, sudden lane. Hollis Bracken walked into the square. He was alone. His face was bruised. His right side was stiff with pain, but he was clean. He wore his good coat. He was not a fugitive. He was an accuser. The posse that had chased him was nowhere to be seen. He had lost them in the high rocks, his home territory, and ridden the long way around. He walked past the stunned faces of his neighbors, past Barlow's men, who were too surprised to move, and stopped in the no-man's land of frozen mud between the crowd and the courthouse steps. Pallardy's face, which had been a mask of righteous authority, turned a dark, mottled red. "Seize him!" he shrieked. "That's one of them, seize the accomplice." Duke Barlow, a bull of a man, shoved two of his men forward. "Take him." The men advanced, but Hollis didn't even look at them. He kept his eyes on Pallardy. "I'm not an accomplice. Judge, I'm a witness. And I am here, before these people, to demand an open hearing on the matter of the co-op fire." "A hearing!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Let the man speak." The murmur grew, a low growl of agreement. "You have no right to demand anything," Pallardy countered, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "You have no evidence. You have accusations. You have nothing." Hollis reached into his coat. For a second, Barlow's men tensed, but he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a small, worn leather pouch. He tossed it, and it landed on the bottom step with a dull, heavy thud. "I have what I saw," Hollis said, his voice carrying in the cold. "I have the testimony of what I found in the ashes, and I have a question." "Where is your key witness? Where is Red Coulter?" Pallardy sneered. "Coulter has been reassigned. Your proof, whatever you imagine it to be, is gone. You are alone. He is not alone." The voice was Tamsin's. A second gasp went through the crowd as she emerged, pushing through the front line of onlookers. She was not the soot-stained fugitive. She was dressed in her best, a dark wool coat, her hair tied back. She looked like the printer, the businesswoman. They all knew. On her shoulder, she carried the heavy brass and wood weight of her father's surveyor's transit. She walked to the center of the square, right next to Hollis, and with a grunt of effort, she slammed the transit's tripod legs onto the frozen ground. The thud was a sound of absolute finality, a surveyor claiming their ground. The crowd surged forward. Barlow's men, whips now coiled in their hands, pushed them back. "You wanted evidence, Judge," Tamsin called out, her voice high and clear, cutting through the noise. She held up the packet of papers. "I have the signed confession of Irving Sloat, admitting you and Duke Barlow paid him to forge the territorial maps." "Lies, forgery," Pallardy shouted. "I have the sworn testimony," she pressed on, her voice rising, "of the star-heeled boot print found at the fire. A boot. You accuse a man over a boot. And I have this," she cried, holding up the small, embroidered linen handkerchief, the blue silk thread border bright against the white. Red Coulter's signature from the depot ledger for 2 cans of whale oil. The accelerant, signed before the fire was even set. A collective roar went up from the crowd. This was not an accusation. This was a chain of proof. Tamsin took a step toward the courthouse. She pointed her finger, the one that had held the needle, directly at the judge. "I have one more question. Judge, and I ask it in front of all of Garnet Hollow. How much did the Silver Meridian pay you to sign your name? How much to burn our food, sell our water, and see me hang for it?" The square exploded. The accusation was too direct, too blunt, to be a lie. "Answer her, Pallardy, thief, land stealer." The judge, his power, his authority, his very world unraveling in front of him, finally broke. His face was a mask of purple rage. He lost all control. "Fools!" he screamed, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. "You'll all thirst. This valley is dry. The Chimney Back Pass will belong to the railroad, and it will be their line, even if every last one of you sod-busting homesteaders dries up and blows away. I've already filed the new surveys. It's the law." It was a full confession. A stunned, terrible silence fell over the square. He had said it. He had admitted to it all. "No, Judge Pallardy." The voice was new. It was cold, sharp, and carried an authority that eclipsed everyone. The crowd turned. At the edge of the square, a man sat on a tall, gray horse. He was lean, wore a federal greatcoat, and had a face like carved granite. Flanking him were 2 U.S. Marshals, their rifles held in the crooks of their arms. And being led between them, his hands chained, his arm in a dirty sling, his face a mask of dull, throbbing defeat, was Red Coulter. The man dismounted. He walked into the square, his boots crunching on the frost. He held up a sheaf of telegrams. "I am Federal Arbiter Elias Thorne," he announced, his voice cutting the silence. "I am here on the request of Miss Tamsin Rowe." He held up the papers. "And I have her messages. I have the ledger entry. I have the confession of Irving Sloat, corroborated by the miners who brought this man." He jerked his head at Coulter, "to my camp in Mint Hollow this very morning." Duke Barlow looked at Pallardy, at Thorne, at the marshals, at Coulter. His world had just ended. He did the only thing a man like him knew how to do. He chose chaos. "Get them!" he roared at his dozen men. "Get the Girl Scatter this mob. Use the whips now." The hired toughs, loyal to the money, sprang into action. They uncoiled their long, black bull whips. The crowd screamed and began to surge back. A wave of panic. A whip cracked, a sound like a gunshot. But before the second whip could fall, a new sound drowned it out, the thunder of hooves. Not from one horse, but from 24, from the alleys on both sides of the square. A line of men on horseback emerged. They were the high country ranchers, the homesteaders, the ones who had listened to Hollis, the ones who had lost their land to Barlow. They rode hard and formed a silent, solid wall of horseflesh and muscle, a living fence between Barlow's thugs and the townspeople. At their head, Sitting on a mule and holding a double-barreled shotgun was Silas, the young depot clerk. Hollis's allies, his insurance. The men with the whip stopped dead. They were facing 2 federal marshals, 20 armed and silent ranchers, and a crowd that was, suddenly, no longer afraid. The standoff was over. It was a checkmate. Judge Thorne walked past the stunned toughs. He walked past Hollis and Tamsin, giving them a single, respectful nod. He walked right up the steps until he was face to face with the trembling, defeated Judge Pallardy. "Enoch Pallardy," Thorne said, his voice cold and final. "By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, your judicial authority in this district is hereby suspended. Your land books, your files, and your office are hereby seized as federal evidence." He turned to the crowd. "The warrant for Tamsin Rowe and Hollis Bracken is vacated. This hearing is now a formal federal inquest, and it will happen. Right here, right now, before all of you." There was no courtroom. There was only the gray, cold sky and the frozen mud of the Garnet Hollow Square. The light snow had returned, small, white flecks that dusted the shoulders of the silent crowd. Judge Elias Thorne had his new bench 2 stacked freight crates dragged from the depot, his federal flag draped over them, hanging limp and slightly askew in the windless air. Judge Pallardy and Duke Barlow stood to one side, unguarded but watched by 2 grim-faced U.S. Marshals. Pallardy's face was a mask of rigid fury, his confidence replaced by a vibrating, silent rage. Barlow just looked bored, as if this was all a bureaucratic inconvenience. But his eyes darted constantly to the line of armed ranchers who still formed a quiet, solid wall at the edge of the square. "This federal inquest is now in session," Judge Thorne said, his voice as cold and clear as the air. He didn't sit. He stood beside his makeshift bench, a tall, imposing figure. "The charges are grave arson, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their territorial water rights, and the willful filing of false legal instruments. We will hear the evidence. Miss Rowe, you will begin." Tamsin stepped forward. She did not look at Pallardy. She addressed her father's surveyor's transit, which she had centered in the square. From her leather tube, she pulled her father's true map, the one with the deep-cut lines, the one she had hidden in her shop, the one Coulter's men had failed to find. She unrolled it and weighted its corners with rocks. "This," she began, her voice steady, "is the true survey of the Chimney Back Pass and the Quailbone Creek watershed, filed with the Territorial Office 8 years ago." She pointed to the transit. "It was made with this instrument. It is verifiable. It is the law." Her finger traced the intricate blue lines, the ones Sloat had been ordered to erase. "These are the aquifers, the springs. They feed every homestead from here to the North Ridge. They are, by the Territorial Water Act of 1867, a public resource. They cannot be owned. They cannot be sold. They cannot be acquired." She then unrolled the fake map, the one Hollis had taken from her wagon, and laid it beside the true one. "And this is the forgery Judge Pallardy filed with the Federal Land Office. This is the lie. He did not just move a few lines. He committed perjury against the land itself. He erased the water. He erased the homesteads. He erased people. And he did it to clear the way for the Silver Meridian Line." Her eyes, dark and unblinking, finally rose and settled on Pallardy. "He burned the co-op to silence the one person who could prove it. He tried to hang me to bury this map." She stepped back. The silence in the square was absolute. The crowd stared at the 2 maps, one a promise, the other a death warrant. "Irving Sloat," Judge Thorne called. The little engraver was pushed forward by a marshal. He was trembling, his watery eyes darting from Barlow to Pallardy. He looked like a cornered rabbit. "Mr. Sloat," Thorne said, "you will state your name and your involvement." Sloat looked at Barlow. Barlow's eyes narrowed. A silent, deadly threat. Sloat's entire body shook. He looked at Tamsin, at her steady gaze. He looked at his own hands, stained black with ink. My name is Irving Sloat. I am an engraver," he stammered, He took a ragged breath and seemed to find a tiny, hidden core of courage. He held up his hands, splaying his fingers for the crowd to see. "I live by this ink. I live by the line. And I made that." He pointed at the forged map. "I made the lie." "At whose behest?" Thorne pressed. Sloat's shaking hand rose, and his finger pointed, not at Pilardi, but directly at the bull-like figure of Duke Barlow. He hired me, him and the judge. They paid me 100 silver dollars. They brought me a copy of Miss Rowe's map and told me to fix it. "Dry it up," Barlow said. "Make it clean for the railroad." And Judge Pilardi, he said he'd make it law. He said if I ever spoke of it. Sloat's voice cracked. "He said he'd have Red Coulter wash my face in my own acid. I swear it on the ink on my hands." The crowd let out a low, angry growl. Barlow just spat on the ground. "Silas," Thorne called. "Silas, from the depot." The young clerk stepped forward, his face pale, but his eyes were set. He had chosen his side. "Mr. Silas," Thorne said, "you were on duty at the telegraph key. Tell this inquest about the signal Q47. It's a railroad code, sir, silver meridian. It means asset secured, or target acquired. We use it when a land deal is closed. And was this signal sent from your depot on the morning of the co-op fire?" "Yes, sir, just before. Maybe 10 minutes before the explosion." Pilardi, who had been silent, let out a snort of contempt. "A railroad code, sent from a railroad office? This proves nothing." "I am not finished. Mr. Pilardi," Thorne said, his voice like ice. "Silas, tell the court the destination of that signal." "From the Silver Meridian office to where—" Silas swallowed, his eyes darting to the furious, red-faced judge. It was routed to the main office in Denver, sir, but it was also copied, on the local wire, to a private key. It was sent to Judge Pilardi's chambers, at the courthouse." The growl in the crowd became a roar. This was the link, the proof of foreknowledge. Pilardi had received the target-acquired signal before the fire had even been set. His face went from red to a sickly, waxy white. "Now," Thorne said. "Mr. Red Coulter." Coulter was shoved forward, his broken wrist bound in a dirty sling, his face a map of bruises from Hollis's rifle. "It's all lies," Coulter shouted before Thorne could even speak. "That map, the signal, it's all fake. That print girl is a witch. She trapped me. She faked that ledger I never signed for no whale oil." "Is that your testimony?" Thorne asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's my word. And my word against hers is law in this valley." "Your word," Thorne said, nodding slowly. "Then let us examine it." He held up the small, embroidered handkerchief. The ledger entry, copied by Miss Rowe and stitched by her own hand. "And here," he said, as a marshal produced the actual S.O. ledger, taken from Abernathy's office. "The original page, the signature matches." "A forgery," Coulter spat. "And this?" Thorne held up a clear, glass jar. Inside it was a small, dark, oily piece of fabric. "A piece of your coat, Mr. Coulter, cut from the sleeve, where you wiped your hands. It was tested at my camp. It is soaked in high-grade signal whale oil, the same oil from this depot ledger." She planted it. "And this," Thorne said, his voice rising, as a miner stepped forward and placed a heavy, square box on the crates. He opened it. Inside was a perfect, plaster-hardened cast of a boot print. "This was taken by the miners from the trail where you ambushed Miss Rowe and Mr. Bracken. And this," a marshal grabbed Coulter's right boot and lifted it, showing the sole to the crowd. The star-shaped cleat was a perfect, damning match. Coulter stared at the cast, then at his boot. The arrogance, the bluster, the rage, it all vanished. He was a trapped animal, and he knew it. He said nothing. The square was so quiet you could hear the snow melting on the rooftops. "Mr. Bracken," Thorne said. Hollis stepped forward. He stood next to Tamsin. He wore no weapon. He simply stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his bruised side making him list slightly to the left. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of his neighbors. He didn't make a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He just talked. "We smelled the oil," he said, his voice plain and clear. "Tamsin knew the smell. I found the boot print. I marked the post." He looked at the townsfolk. "My mark, the hanging T. You all know it. It's on the fence post by the alley, right where that cast was made. We went to the depot. We got the proof. We were ambushed. We got the confession. We were hunted. And now we're here." He turned and looked at Judge Thorne. "We didn't do it because it was easy. We did it because it was right. That's our testimony." His simple, unadorned speech, the calm recital of facts, was more devastating than any lawyer's argument. It was the truth, plain and simple. Judge Elias Thorne surveyed the scene, the 2 maps, the confession, the handkerchief, the oil, the boot cast, the silent, defeated prisoners, the armed, waiting ranchers, the furious, expectant crowd. He was a federal judge. He knew the law. He also knew the frontier. "Mr. Pallardy," Thorne said, "you have spent your career citing the law. Let us cite it now. The law requires a jury of peers. This is a courtroom of peers." He pointed to the crowd. "Marshal, select a jury. 12 men. Men who own land here. Men who work it. I want a merchant. I want a miner. I want a homesteader. I want a rancher, now." Pallardy's face went white. A vein in his temple, a small blue worm, began to throb, fast and violent. He started to sweat, the small beads of moisture visible in the cold air. "You can't. This is not a legal venue. This is a mob. I demand a transfer to a federal court." "You are in a federal court, Mr. Pallardy," Thorne snapped. "And the law is what I say it is, until a higher court says otherwise." The jury was formed in less than 2 minutes. 12 grim-faced men, including Silas, and the lead miner who had captured Coulter. They huddled by the courthouse steps. There was no deliberation. There was just a series of angry nods. The lead miner stepped forward. "We don't need to talk, Judge. We find the evidence is more than credible. We find that the charge is arson, conspiracy to steal water, and false accusation are true. We find them guilty." Judge Thorne nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin. The verdict was in. He held up his hand, silencing the murmur that had begun to sweep the crowd. "Enoch Pallardy and Duke Barlow, based on the evidence presented, and the findings of this jury, I am issuing a federal warrant for your immediate arrest on charges of conspiracy, mail and wire fraud, perjury, and attempted murder." He pointed at the marshals. "Secure the prisoners." He wasn't finished. "Furthermore, all assets, bank accounts, and properties held by Mr. Pallardy and Mr. Barlow are hereby frozen, pending a full federal audit. The forged map is stricken from the record. The Q-47 land transfer is null and void." He looked at Tamsin, and then at the crowd. "And finally, I am issuing a federal injunction, permanent and binding, protecting the Quailbone Creek watershed and its associated aquifers. The water belongs to the people of this valley." The marshals stepped forward. Barlow, seeing it was truly over, simply put his hands out, a look of profound disgust on his face. But Pallardy crumbled. The man who had been a king just an hour before seemed to shrink, his fine suit suddenly too large for him. "You can't," he whispered, as the marshal pulled his hands behind his back. I am the law." The marshal ignored him. He produced a set of heavy, steel cuffs. He snapped the first one onto Pallardy's right wrist. Click-shrack. He snapped the second one. Click-shrack. The sound was shockingly loud in the silent square. It was the sound of a trap springing, the sound of a lock closing, the sound of an era ending. There was no cheer, not at first. No one shouted. Instead, a great, collective sigh, a sound that was half-groan, half-sob, rose from the crowd. It was the sound of a valley that had been holding its breath for 3 days, for 3 years, for a decade. It was the sound of the land itself, finally, breathing out. The trial was over. The aftermath was a strange, stunned silence. Judge Thorne gave his orders, his voice the only one that seemed to work. The marshals their faces impassive, led Pallardy and Barlow away, their honor and power gone. Just two cuffed men in the mud. The crowd didn't erupt. They let out a great, collective sigh, the sound of a valley unclenching its fist. People began to move, to touch, to talk in low, amazed voices. Men who hadn't looked Hollis in the eye for a month now clapped his bruised shoulder. Women, their faces wet with tears, reached out to touch Tamsin's arm as she passed, as if to see if she were real. Silas, the depot clerk, was being hoisted onto the shoulders of the miners. A hero. Hollis and Tamsin didn't stay. They didn't wait for the congratulations. They just turned and began to walk. They walked through the streets of Garnet Hollow, past her shop, boarded and dark, and past the smoldering ruins of the co-op. They walked onto the open road that led to the Quail Bone. And as they did, the sky, which had been a cold, gray lid, finally broke. A heavy late winter rain began to fall. It wasn't a blizzard, not a sleet. It was a drenching, cleansing downpour, a flood that washed the soot from the air and the last of the frost from the ground. They walked the 2 miles back to the ranch, side by side, not speaking. There were no words left. They were soaked to the bone by the time they reached the gate, the one that held their carved, silent promise. The lamp they had left burning in the window was a warm, yellow beacon in the gray deluge. They climbed the steps and stood under the shelter of the porch. They were dripping, their hair plastered to their heads, looking out at the valley that was finally, truly theirs. And then, a sound. It was Hollis, a low, rough chuckle that cracked in his throat, a sound of pure, pained relief. Tamsin looked at him, at his bruised face and his soaking wet hair, and a smile broke across her own. She started to laugh. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was the sound of a spring, coiled tight for a lifetime, finally breaking free. It was the sound of survival. They stood on the porch, wrapped in the roar of the rain, and laughed like two people who had just walked through a storm that had lasted their entire lives. Tamsin's laughter subsided into a deep, shuddering breath. Her hand went to her throat. The small, ink-stained, silk-stitched linen handkerchief was still there, tied around her neck. She had worn it as her only armor. Her fingers, steady and sure, worked the knot. She pulled the small, damp square of cloth free. She looked at it, this thing that had started it all, this fragile, blurred, and stubborn piece of truth. She turned. She didn't go into the house. She walked to the main porch post, the thick cedar beam that held up the roof, the one that faced the road. And with slow, deliberate motions, she tied the handkerchief around it, the blue T and the stitched border facing out. "It's a marker," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the rain. "A new one. This house belongs to the truth. I want everyone who rides up this path to see it first." Hollis watched her, his gaze soft. He looked at the small, defiant flag. He looked at her. She was shivering. The cold, wet reality was setting in. He stepped close to her. He raised his hand, the one that wasn't throbbing from his fall. He didn't reach for her. He reached for the top button of her heavy wool coat. It was dark, wet, and cold. His rough, calloused fingers brushed the fabric, and his eyes held hers. He didn't try to unfasten it. He simply grasped the thick lapels of her coat, and with that same profound, gentle respect, he pulled the sides together, folding one over the other, tucking the collar tight under her chin to shield her from the wind. It was a gesture of pure, quiet care. It was an answer. Their eyes, in the gray, wet light, said everything. "It's over." Tamsin's hand came up and covered his, where it rested on her collar. His hand was large and warm, and she pressed it there, holding it against her heart. She leaned into his touch. "Just a fraction." "That bench," she said, her voice a low murmur, her eyes never leaving his. "The one where we listen to the rain? I want to sit there." She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his, and gently pulled him the 2 steps to the long, high-backed wooden bench, the same bench where she had laid her head, where he had knelt beside her. She sat and pulled him down beside her. They sat for a long moment, side by side in the dim light. The world reduced to the sound of the rain drumming on the tin roof. It was a steady, percussive, pounding beat. The beat of a heart. He turned to her. She turned to him. This time, there was no fear. There was no hesitation. No darkness, no hiding. He leaned in. She met him. The kiss was slow, deep, and warm. It was a kiss of profound relief, a kiss of homecoming. It tasted of the rain and the cold air, but underneath it was a fire that had been banked and waiting. His lips were sure and patient. His other hand, the one that had held her steady, came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the faint, faded line of the bruise on her cheek, wiping away the last memory of the violence. Her free hand came up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath the damp wool. Their clasped hands tightened, held, relaxed, and then tightened again. A silent, rhythmic language that matched the rain, that matched their breathing, which had slowed and deepened, becoming one. He drew back, but only an inch, resting his forehead against hers. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, thick whisper, vibrating with the memory of the promise he had made in the dark. "I told you," he murmured. "I told you I would call your name. In the broad daylight, in the middle of town." A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. Her eyes, still closed, crinkled at the corners. "You did. Hollis, you stood right next to me, in front of the entire valley. You kept your promise." "No," he said, pulling back so he could see her face, his gaze intense. "That was for them. This is for us." She opened her eyes, a question in them. He stood up. He walked past the shelter of the roof, down the 3 steps, and out into the center of the yard, into the pouring, drenching rain. He stood there, soaked and defiant, and turned his face, not to the house, but to the wide-open, empty fields, to the valley, to the sky. He filled his lungs, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in his bruised ribs. "Tamsin Row." His voice was a great, raw, joyous shout. It wasn't just a name. It was an oath. It was a claim. It was the sound of a man who had found the one thing he was missing. The call echoed off the near canyon wall and was carried away by the rain. He stood there, his hair plastered to his head, a wide, reckless grin splitting his face. Tamsin watched him, her heart so full it felt like it might break. He walked back, dripping, and climbed the steps. She didn't get up. She leaned back against the hard wood of the bench, just as she had before. Her eyes, half closed, were shining. She held out her hand to him. He took it, and she pulled. He sat, and she moved, turning into him, pulling him into an embrace. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and she buried her face in the damp, solid wool of his shoulder. He rested his head against her hair. They just held each other. It wasn't a desperate clutch for survival. It was a slow, sure, solid hold that meant home. The boundaries, the lines of respect he had drawn so carefully, were still there. They hadn't vanished. They had simply become the foundation. This wasn't a fire made to flash and die. It was a fire built to be warm, a fire built to last. And as they sat, locked together, a new sound cut through the rain, faintly, from Garnet Hollow. The deep iron bell of the town church began to ring. Not an alarm, not a toll, a slow, steady, joyous peal of celebration. At that same moment, down by the head of Quailbone Creek, where the homesteaders' land began, a small group of ranchers, the ones who had formed the Wall of Horses, sat on their mounts in the rain. One of them, the lead miner, leaned from his saddle. He gripped the top of the brand-new, arrogant sign that Barlow's men had hammered into the mud. Property of the Silver Meridian Railroad. Private, no water access. With a grunt, he ripped it from the earth. He held it aloft for a moment, a symbol of the defeated lie. And then he hurled it down onto the rocks. It landed with a sharp, metallic, final clang. The water was free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it a hype, so this story can be heard by more folks.